Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. The night sky stretched endlessly above the old train tracks. We were out there, just friends on a camping trip, away from everything. No phones, no towns, just the woods and the faint sound of a distant train. It was supposed to be peaceful. A night of campfires, laughter, and staring up at the stars. But everything changed when we stumbled across the old station. We hadn't planned on visiting it. It wasn't on any map, but curiosity led us off the trail. The station had been abandoned for decades, weathered by time and overgrown with vines. The roof had caved in, leaving skeletal beams exposed. It was eerie, but we thought it would make a cool spot to rest for a while. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. The wooden floor groaned underfoot, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like thin curtains. We joked about the ghosts, making light of the old station's dark past, but something didn't feel right. As we wandered deeper into the building, one of my friends, Emily, stopped abruptly, staring at the wall. We all gathered around, shining our flashlights where she pointed. The wall was covered in writing. Scrawled in faded, jagged letters were words that made my blood run cold. Help us. None of us spoke. We stood there, frozen, as if the very silence around us was pressing down. There were other messages, scratched out beneath, phrases we couldn't make sense of. Words about trains, about waiting, and something else entirely. They're still coming. That's when the whispers began. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I turned to see if anyone else had heard them, but my friends were motionless, their eyes wide with fear. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. It felt like they were closing in on us. We bolted from the building, running back toward our campsite, the sound of our footsteps drowned out by the endless rustling of the trees. My chest heaved as we made it back to the clearing, but we couldn't escape what followed. Back at the campfire, we all sat in silence, watching the flickering flames. I kept glancing toward the trees, waiting, expecting to hear something again. But it was the quiet that frightened me the most. The rest of the night passed without another sound, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying those words, that feeling of being watched. Even now, I wonder what was meant by those messages, and if they're still out there, waiting. We left the station behind, but the memories of what we saw have never left me. The train is long gone, but I know they're still out there. I was always someone who believed in the familiar, the predictable. My life had always been about routine, and I liked it that way. That's why, when my friend convinced me to take a road trip to an old remote lighthouse for the weekend, I wasn't thrilled, but I went along anyway. It wasn't the kind of place I'd ever consider visiting, but something about the isolation appealed to my friend, and I didn't want to miss out. The lighthouse was situated on a rugged coastline, far from civilization. The drive there took hours, and as we approached, the only sounds were the wind and the crashing waves below. There were no other cars on the road, no other people. It felt as if we had stepped into a world that no one else remembered. When we finally reached the lighthouse, we parked and began our hike up the steep, crumbling path that led to the base. The wind was strong, biting through our jackets as we made our way to the top. The view from the lighthouse was breathtaking. Vast, empty stretches of ocean and rocky cliffs stretching into the horizon. We spent the day exploring the area, taking photos, and marveling at how quiet everything was. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the land, we decided to climb inside the lighthouse. The door creaked open, and the smell of old, damp wood hit us. Inside, the old spiral staircase wound up into darkness. We climbed carefully, each step echoing louder than before. The higher we went, the colder it became. I had a strange sensation that someone, something, was watching us from the shadows below. When we reached the top, the wind howled louder than ever. The view was incredible, but the feeling of being completely alone started to gnaw at my thoughts. The sky was painted in deep purples and oranges, and the ocean stretched endlessly before us. It was peaceful, yet something felt off. As we explored the small room at the top of the lighthouse, we found old, faded charts and logs, abandoned years ago. The emptiness was almost overwhelming. I kept glancing behind me, as if expecting to see someone, or something, watching from the corners of the room. We stayed until the sun had fully set, but as the darkness deepened, my unease grew. The wind had died down now, leaving a heavy silence. It felt as though the world had stopped turning. My friend began to pack up, but I stayed by the window staring at the horizon, waiting for something that I couldn't put into words. It wasn't until I was about to leave the room that I noticed something strange. On one of the old, dusty tables by the window, there was a single, neatly folded piece of paper. I almost missed it, but something about the way it seemed out of place drew my attention. Curious, I unfolded it. It wasn't a log or any kind of note I could make sense of. The writing was old and faded, but as I read it, a chill ran down my spine. They watch. They listen. Always. We begged for help, but there was no one left to hear. They took them all. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around the empty room, my eyes scanning the shadows. The silence felt heavier than ever, and my pulse began to race. I wasn't alone. I tucked the paper into my jacket, and we left the lighthouse as quickly as we could, the weight of what I had read pressing down on me. The drive back was quiet, but every shadow seemed to whisper in my mind, and the thought of that unknown presence stayed with me long after we left. To this day, I still wonder who wrote that note, and what it meant. It was a quiet evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old orchard at the edge of town. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rolling hills, and the air was crisp. We had heard stories about the orchard, about how it had once been a thriving farm, but now lay abandoned, overgrown with wild grass and tangled vines. None of us really knew what to expect, but something about the place drew us there. Maybe it was the thrill of something forgotten, something lost to time. The old farmhouse at the center of the orchard stood there, half collapsed, its windows shattered and roof caved in. The wooden beams creaked softly in the wind, as if the house itself was moaning. We parked the car at the edge of the orchard and walked deeper into the field. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, covered in fallen apples and weeds. The air smelled earthy, and there was a faint sweetness from the ripened fruit still hanging from the trees. As we approached the farmhouse, the feeling of being watched set in. It wasn't the kind of eerie quiet you'd expect. No birds sang, no rustling of leaves. It was dead quiet. Too quiet. We made our way inside, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath us. The place was a mess. Old furniture scattered, walls splintered, and dust floating through the air like whispers. A sense of unease clung to the room, heavier with each passing second. It wasn't just the silence. It was as if something had been waiting in the shadows for us. One of my friends, Sarah, wandered into the next room. I followed behind, but stopped when I noticed something odd. In the corner of the room, there was a chair. No, 2 chairs. Both were facing each other, but they were old, cracked, as if they hadn't been touched in years. The legs were splintered, and dust coated the seats like a film. What disturbed me most was the way they seemed to be positioned, like they had been placed deliberately, waiting for something or someone. "Why are the chairs like that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sarah replied, frowning. "It's creepy." We both stood there, staring at the chairs, the silence pressing down harder. I had the sudden, irrational thought that someone, or something, might be sitting there, just out of sight. As we explored further, we came across the kitchen. The cabinets were open, broken plates and jars scattered on the floor. It was here that we found the most unsettling thing of all, a photograph. It was crumpled, lying on the countertop. A family of 4 stared back at us. The man and woman smiled weakly, while 2 children sat on either side of them. What caught our attention wasn't the photo itself, but the absence of their faces. The photo had been torn, their features missing as though someone had tried to erase them. All that remained were empty eyes, hollow and void of life. "What happened here?" Sarah whispered. Her voice trembled. "I don't know," I replied, my throat dry. As we turned to leave, I noticed something moving outside the shattered window. A figure, thin, tall, standing in the distance just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out any features, only the silhouette of someone or something watching us from the edge of the orchard. My heart pounded and I stepped back, whispering, "Do you see that?" Sarah followed my gaze, her eyes widening. I saw it too. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. Its presence felt ancient, as though it had been waiting for us to arrive. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing her hand. As we hurried toward the car, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something, anything, trailing behind us. But there was nothing. The figure remained distant, still unmoving. Once we reached the car and drove away, I stole one last glance in the rearview mirror. The orchard was behind us, the farmhouse a dark silhouette against the fading light, and still I felt that unseen gaze following us. To this day, I can't explain what we saw or didn't see, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was waiting, and it's still out there. It was a quiet evening in my apartment, the kind where the city feels distant despite being just outside the window. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant car passing by. I had just settled in for the night, the blinds drawn and the dim glow of my desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. I wasn't sure how long I had been sitting there when I noticed something strange. It was faint at first, a whispering sound, barely audible, like someone was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the wind or some noise from the neighbors. But it wasn't just outside the window. It was inside my apartment. I listened closer, holding my breath. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from any specific direction, but rather seemed to be coming from everywhere. It felt like the walls were alive, the air itself vibrating with those strange, unintelligible sounds. I got up and moved toward the hallway, my footsteps echoing faintly. The whispers followed, as if they were inside my head. I turned on the hallway light, hoping it would stop whatever was making that sound, but the light did nothing. The whispers continued, now more persistent, almost like they were speaking my name. The sound was almost melodic, but there was something eerie about it, something off. I decided to step into my bedroom and close the door behind me. The moment I did, the whispers stopped. It was quiet again, the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, this time, more clear, coming from just outside the door. "Let me in." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't like any sound I've ever heard before. It was low, hollow, almost mechanical, but filled with an unnatural urgency. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my entire body trembling. "Let me in," the voice repeated, louder this time, like it was right outside the door. I could feel the floor beneath me shaking slightly, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. I knew I had to do something. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking as I tried to call the police. The line rang and rang, but no one answered. The phone died, the screen flickering, leaving me in total silence once again. The whispers started again, this time from deeper inside the apartment, coming from the shadows that seemed to stretch across the floor like living things. They didn't make any sense, but they were there, filling the air with a sense of dread that I couldn't escape. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my room, with the door locked, listening to those whispers until the first light of dawn broke through my blinds. When morning finally came, everything was quiet. No signs of anything strange. My apartment looked the same, as if nothing had happened. But the whispers, they haven't stopped. I still hear them sometimes, late at night when the city noise dies down and the silence takes over. I don't know what they are, but I know they're still there, waiting. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip. My friends and I decided to rent a small, secluded cabin by a quiet lake in the mountains. No phones, no internet, just nature and us, looking to escape the city for a few days. I wasn't expecting much, just peace and quiet, maybe a few beers by the fire. The cabin was far off the beaten path, accessible only by a narrow dirt road winding through the forest. We arrived at sunset, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The cabin itself was old but charming, built from rough timber and surrounded by tall trees. It felt like the perfect escape. That first night, everything was peaceful. We unpacked, built a fire, and enjoyed the stillness of the night. The only sounds were the crackling flames and the occasional rustle of the trees in the breeze. After a few hours, we turned in, exhausted from the long drive. I awoke sometime later. The cabin was quiet, but there was a faint noise that drew me from my sleep. A soft, thudding sound like someone knocking just outside the window. I sat up, my heart pounding. The window was shuttered, but the sound grew louder as if someone was knocking again and again, faster now. I didn't want to believe it, but the thudding was rhythmic, persistent, and coming from right outside. The others were fast asleep, unaware, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping up my spine. I stayed perfectly still, listening, as the sound became louder, more frantic, then silence. My breath caught in my throat as I waited, straining to hear any movement outside. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the night. In the morning, I told my friends about the noise, but they brushed it off. Probably just an animal, they said. I wanted to believe that, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. That afternoon, we decided to go for a hike along one of the trails nearby. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, but there was nothing behind us, just the endless trees and the winding trail. Still, the sense of unease persisted. When we returned to the cabin, something felt different. The air was thicker, the silence more oppressive. That night, as we gathered around the fire, I noticed something strange. The fire flickered unnaturally, casting distorted shadows on the walls. I kept thinking about the knocking I heard, wondering if whatever made that sound had followed us. We decided to turn in early, and once again, I awoke in the middle of the night, this time to the sound of faint whispering. It was soft, almost drowned out by the rustling trees outside, but it was there. I sat up, listening intently, trying to make out what was being said, but the words were indistinct, like they were carried away by the wind. I couldn't move. The whispering grew louder, clearer, until I could almost make out what they were saying. And then it stopped. Just like before, the silence returned. The next morning, I woke to find a dark smear on the window, the same window that had the shutter knocked on the night before. I wasn't sure what it was. It looked like something had pressed itself against the glass, leaving a mark that wouldn't wipe away. That day, my friends decided to leave. I wanted to stay, but the fear of what had been outside was too much to ignore. As we packed the car, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin one last time. The woods were silent as they had always been, but I knew I wasn't alone. The knocking was still out there, waiting. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker, someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting, always watching. I've always loved the forest. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees, the fresh air, and the quiet that draws me in. So, when my friends suggested a weekend camping trip deep into the woods, I didn't hesitate. It sounded perfect, peaceful, serene, just what we needed to escape from the chaos of city life. We packed up our gear, grabbed some supplies, and hiked several miles into the heart of the forest. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in fallen leaves, but the scenery was breathtaking. As we set up camp, I remember how quiet everything felt. No distant sounds of cars, no faint hum of electricity, just us and the wilderness. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat around, laughing and enjoying each other's company. I had never felt more at peace. But when we decided to turn in, something shifted. That night, I kept waking up, hearing strange noises just beyond the trees. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the occasional hoot of an owl. These were softer, quieter sounds, almost like whispers. I brushed them off at first, telling myself it was just the wind, but something about the tone of those whispers felt wrong. Intimate, almost as though they were meant for someone, not just the forest. The second night, things felt different. I couldn't sleep at all. The forest had gone silent. Not the kind of silence you're used to when you're out in nature, but an unnatural, almost oppressive quiet. There wasn't a single sound from any creature. No crickets, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if the forest had been drained of all life. At one point, I decided to step out of the tent and check the surroundings. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I shone my flashlight into the woods, expecting to see some critters or movement, but there was nothing. Just darkness. I called out to my friends, but my voice felt swallowed by the stillness. Then I saw it. Something standing far off, just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't a person, at least not a normal one. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and it didn't move like a human. Its silhouette was dark, almost blending into the night, but the more I stared, the more I felt like its presence was wrong. The air seemed to pulse around it, and I swear I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. I froze, my breath hitching. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It didn't seem curious. It didn't feel human. It felt watchful in a way that made my skin crawl. I backed away, slowly retreating into the tent, my heart racing. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me flinch, but nothing else came. The next morning, my friends were awake, laughing, acting like nothing had happened. They didn't hear the whispers, didn't see the figure in the woods. When I told them, they just shrugged it off, calling me paranoid. I didn't press the issue. We packed up our gear, leaving the quiet forest behind us, still unsure of what we'd encountered. It wasn't until we were back in town that I realized something truly terrifying. I checked my phone. No service, as expected. But when I scrolled through my pictures from the trip, I froze at what I found. In the photos from the night before, something appeared. A faint, shadowy figure standing among the trees, barely visible but unmistakably there. It wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination. It was real. And somehow, whatever it was, it had been watching us. I don't know what it wanted, and I never want to go back to that place. Some things are better left unseen. It was an ordinary Saturday when we decided to explore the old lake. It wasn't just any lake. It was surrounded by dense woods, hidden far from the main road. My friends and I had stumbled upon it years ago while hiking, but never spent much time there. Today, curiosity got the better of us. We packed a picnic and drove out, eager to spend the afternoon away from the usual noise of the city. The day was perfect at first. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, and the lake itself was calm and inviting. We set up our blankets near the shore, and for a few hours it felt like the world had stopped. We swam, took photos, and laughed under the canopy of trees. The forest around us seemed alive, buzzing with insects and birds. But there was something else, something that felt off. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, we began to hear faint whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time, like voices carried from the depths of the woods. I turned to my friends, but none of them seemed to hear it. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They shook their heads, focused on the lake. I stood up, looking toward the trees. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and now I was certain I wasn't imagining it. They weren't words, just faint, distorted murmurs, like something from a dream, calling out from the forest. "We should go back," I said, my heart starting to race. The feeling of unease was creeping in, swallowing any sense of peace we had earlier. "No way," one of my friends laughed. "We've got another hour of daylight, we're fine." I hesitated, wanting to stay but feeling that nagging, primal instinct to get out. Still, we stayed a little longer, hoping the sounds would fade. But they didn't. It was like the forest was alive, its very trees whispering to each other. The murmurs were all around us now, growing louder, almost like they were speaking directly to us. One of my friends, Mark, turned white as he stared at the woods, his eyes wide and searching. "I swear I hear something," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not normal." I glanced at the others. None of them seemed to be reacting as strongly, but I could see the tension in their faces. The air had turned colder and the woods were shifting. Silent one moment, then alive with rustling leaves and distant sounds. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon, casting the area in shadows. Everything seemed to grow darker, more foreboding. Mark stood up, his voice barely audible. "We need to go. Now." The others agreed, though reluctantly. We quickly packed our things, keeping our eyes on the trees, half expecting something to emerge from them. The whispers grew louder as we walked toward the car, but no one spoke, too caught up in the creeping dread. When we reached the car, I turned back one last time, searching the forest for any sign of life. That's when I saw it, just a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It wasn't human, though. It was long and twisted, like a shadow, but with shape. It vanished in an instant, but I knew it had been watching us. My friends didn't see it, and I didn't say a word. I just got in the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. We drove away from the lake in silence, leaving the strange murmurs behind us. As we drove back toward the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the darkness. I've never been back to that lake, and I never planned to. Whatever was out there, it felt alive, watching, waiting. And I know now, some things are better left unexplored. It was just a quiet evening walk. I lived near a small town with few places to go. The woods always felt a little too close, too oppressive, but I had always found peace in the stillness of the forest. That night, after dinner, I decided to take a stroll down the old, barely used path that led to the edge of the woods. The sun had just set, leaving a thin strip of light that barely illuminated the ground. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something faint and unfamiliar. I shrugged it off, pulling my jacket tighter around me as I walked. The path was overgrown, the grass brushing against my legs as I made my way deeper into the woods. As I moved further, I noticed how quiet it had become. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just a suffocating silence. It wasn't unusual for the woods to feel deserted, but this felt different. The usual comforting stillness was now oppressive, almost as if the trees themselves were watching me. I kept walking, pushing forward until I stumbled upon something strange. There, just off the path, was an old, weathered cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, the wood faded and rotting, with a thin layer of ivy growing over the walls. I stopped, my curiosity overpowering the gnawing sense of unease that had settled in my gut. There were no signs of life. No lights, no smoke from a chimney. The windows were covered in grime, and the door hung slightly ajar. I stood there, unsure why I was even considering stepping closer. But something about it drew me in. I crept closer, my footsteps crunching against the dirt. The door creaked as I pushed it open just enough to peek inside. The darkness beyond was complete, thick and suffocating. My flashlight barely cut through the shadows, revealing broken furniture, dusty remnants of a life that had long been abandoned. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped inside. The air inside the cabin smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. The silence was absolute. I kept moving through the rooms, uneasy with each creak of the old floorboards beneath me. That's when I noticed it. The faintest sound, a soft whisper, carried through the stillness. It wasn't coming from the cabin itself, but from outside, a whisper that seemed to echo from deep within the woods. I froze, listening intently. The whisper didn't make any sense. No words, just a soft, chilling hum, as if something was calling out. I didn't know why I did it, but I stepped toward the window, pressing my forehead against the cold glass, trying to see into the darkness outside. There was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the oppressive silence. And then I heard it again, closer this time. A faint scraping sound like nails dragging across wood. I jerked back, my breath hitching. The whispers had stopped, but now I could hear something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving through the underbrush. Panic surged through me and I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the source of the sound. But there was nothing there. Only trees, their twisted shapes looming in the dark. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps came closer, impossibly close now, though there was still nothing to be seen. My breath came out in ragged gasps, each step echoing louder, more deliberate. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the sound stopped. The cabin was silent once again. I didn't wait to find out what was out there. I ran, not bothering to glance back. The woods felt alive, shifting around me, the trees now towering like silent watchers. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the open road, the lights of my town flickering far in the distance. Even now, I wonder what might have been waiting in the shadows. It was supposed to be a simple trip. A group of friends and I decided to spend the day at the lake, looking forward to some sun, swimming, and grilling burgers. We had rented a small cabin by the water, tucked away from the main shore, surrounded by tall trees. The plan was to relax and enjoy the quiet, but things quickly went south. We arrived early in the morning, and the place was exactly as we'd pictured: peaceful, remote, far from the noise of civilization. We set up camp near the lake, took out the boats, and spent the first half of the day swimming and joking around. The water was cool and refreshing, and we all felt content. Around midday, we decided to take a hike along the trail that followed the shoreline. The trees stretched high above us, casting long shadows over the dirt path. We walked for about an hour, laughing and pointing out strange-looking rocks or trees that had been twisted by the wind. It was nice, peaceful even. That's when it happened. We came across an old, weathered sign that pointed off the trail. "No trespassing," it read. We hesitated for a moment, unsure if we should follow it. Curiosity got the better of us, and one of us, the bravest, or perhaps the most reckless, led the way. The trail disappeared into thick undergrowth. The trees grew closer together, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was eerily quiet now, with only the faint rustling of leaves as the wind shifted. We walked for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing down on us. Suddenly, we stopped. The trail ended abruptly in front of us, but it wasn't just a dead end. It was as if something had been cleared away, as though we weren't meant to go any further. The ground was packed hard, with claw marks etched into the earth as if something had been dragged through there. My stomach twisted at the sight. We turned back, uneasy now. As we retraced our steps, we realized the forest felt wrong. The air was thick, colder somehow, and the silence was oppressive. I could hear my friends breathing, each breath sharp and shallow. The usual sounds of birds and insects had vanished. When we made it back to the lake, the cabin was still in sight, but something had changed. The sunlight seemed dimmer, the air colder. It wasn't until we were nearly back that we noticed it. Someone had followed us. At first, I thought it was just one of our own shadows, but when I turned to glance behind us, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, far away but clear enough to make out. It wasn't moving, just watching. We didn't speak. We just bolted toward the cabin, leaving the figure behind. Inside, we locked all the doors and windows, hearts racing. We tried to convince ourselves it was just someone from a neighboring cabin, maybe a hiker who had wandered off trail. But deep down, we knew better. The figure had been watching us, waiting. The rest of the day passed in a blur of silence and paranoia. We didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin made us jump. We knew whatever had followed us was still out there, waiting in the dark. By morning, the figure was gone, but the fear remained. Whatever had followed us wasn't human, or at least not anymore. The day had started off ordinary, just another lazy afternoon. I decided to explore the old abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place everyone whispered about but no one dared to enter. The house had always been shrouded in mystery, sitting at the edge of the forest like a relic from another time. The locals said strange things happened there: whispers in the night, disappearing pets, shadows in the corners of windows. I parked my car on the gravel path and made my way toward the house. The old wooden planks groaned beneath my feet, each step echoing eerily in the quiet. The front door creaked open without much resistance, revealing a dark, empty interior. Dust covered everything and the air smelled of decay. I walked through the rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. Furniture had been overturned, and old photos lay scattered on the floor, their faces faded beyond recognition. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath my weight. As I wandered deeper into the house, I began to hear something. Faint whispers, barely audible but persistent. I paused, holding my breath, straining to make out what they were saying. It was almost like the house itself was murmuring secrets, as if the walls were alive with memories. I shook off the chill that ran down my spine and pressed on. The whispers grew louder as I reached the top of the staircase. They seemed to be coming from the room at the end of the hall. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed open the door. Inside, the room was bare except for an old mirror standing in the corner. It was cracked, its glass dull and warped. I couldn't look away, compelled by some strange force. As I stared into the mirror, I saw my reflection distort, my face twisting, becoming something wrong. The whispers became screams, louder now, echoing in my ears. I stumbled back, the distorted figure in the mirror now staring at me, its hollow eyes gleaming. I could feel it watching me, not just in the reflection, but in the real world. My breath came in shallow gasps and I backed away from the mirror, tripping over the furniture as I fled the room. As I ran down the hall, I glanced behind me and caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, black and shifting, racing after me. I could hear it breathing, ragged and uneven, closing the distance between us. I burst out of the house, the door slamming shut behind me. The air outside was thick, oppressive, and silent once again. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I've never returned to that farmhouse. The whispers still echo in my ears, and sometimes I swear I see that shadow lurking just at the edge of my vision. Whatever was in that house, whatever was chasing me, it's still there, waiting. It was the kind of day that felt too perfect to be real, the kind of day you only ever see in old photos or travel brochures. My friends and I decided to take a trip out to a secluded beach, tucked away from the usual tourist spots. We'd heard whispers of its beauty from a few locals, but no one really talked about what else might be there. We didn't care. We just wanted the peace and quiet. The drive there was uneventful, winding through winding, narrow roads that twisted through dense forests. The radio played softly, our conversations mellow, as we joked about what kind of adventures awaited us at the shore. It felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. We finally reached the beach in the late afternoon, the sun already low on the horizon. The sand stretched out in front of us, golden and untouched. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore was soothing. For the first time in a long time, we truly felt free. We spent the day swimming, building sandcastles, and exploring the tide pools. It was idyllic. But as the sun dipped further, casting long shadows across the sand, something started to feel off. The beach, once full of laughter and cheer, grew quiet. The air seemed to thicken, the usual comforting sounds of waves and birds fading into silence. It wasn't that we felt unwelcome, just uneasy, like something was watching. As the last light of the day faded, we gathered our things, feeling reluctant to leave the peaceful stretch of shore behind. I was about to suggest we head back when one of my friends, Laura, stopped dead in her tracks. "Wait, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaky. We all stopped and strained to listen. At first, it was just the sound of the ocean, but then I realized she wasn't talking about the waves. There was something else, a faint, rhythmic thudding, soft but insistent, like something hitting the ground just beyond the edge of the trees. "What is that?" I whispered, my stomach tightening. We couldn't see anything, just the dark silhouettes of trees looming beyond the beach. The sound grew louder, closer, and now I was sure I could hear another noise. Whispers. Low, unintelligible voices like they were murmuring right at the edge of hearing. "I think we should go," one of my other friends, Mike, said, his voice barely above a whisper. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Maybe someone's camping out there," Laura suggested, but her words trembled as she spoke. The thudding noise stopped abruptly and the whispers fell silent. A sudden chill swept through the air. It felt like something had just moved, watching us from the darkness. "I think we should go now," I said, my voice firm. The fear in the air was impossible to ignore. We started walking quickly toward the car parked at the edge of the forest. My mind was racing. What could have made that noise? What had those whispers been? As we neared the edge of the woods, something caught my eye. A figure just beyond the tree line. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. It was dark, featureless, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I stopped, unable to look away. "Come on," Mike yelled from a few steps ahead. I blinked, shaking my head. The figure was gone. We piled into the car, driving quickly away from the beach. The silence inside was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. None of us spoke, each lost in our own thoughts. That feeling, the sensation of being watched, hadn't left any of us. It wasn't until we were back in town that Laura spoke up again, her voice breaking the silence. "I've never told anyone this, but when I was walking down the beach earlier, I saw something in the water," she said quietly. A face, floating beneath the surface. It wasn't human. We all fell silent. None of us had seen the face she mentioned, but somehow I wasn't surprised. What we heard, what we saw, whatever it was still there, watching from the shadows of the trees. To this day, I haven't returned to that beach. And I never will. I never believed in anything supernatural, not until that night in the old apartment complex. I had just moved to the city, renting a tiny unit on the third floor of a building that felt like it had seen better days. The building wasn't in the best part of town, but it was cheap, and for someone just starting out, it seemed like a good place to lay low. The first night, I didn't think much of the creaking sounds. The building had that old, eerie feel, with narrow hallways that seemed to stretch into the darkness. I figured it was just the building settling, nothing more. But as the days went by, those sounds became harder to ignore. It started subtly, Every evening around the same time, around 11 p.m., the sound would return. It was faint at first, distant, like someone walking, but as the days passed, it got louder, more distinct. It wasn't just footsteps, though. There was a strange, hollow tapping sound that accompanied them. It echoed through the long hallways like someone was knocking on invisible doors. At first, I thought it was just the building's ventilation system acting up. I made excuses, maybe pipes rattling or some old wiring. But one evening, after I heard it again, I decided to investigate. I stepped into the hallway, my breath visible in the dim, flickering lights. The hallway was empty. I could still hear the footsteps, quick and measured like someone was pacing back and forth in the darkness. I followed the sound, stepping cautiously, heart pounding. The hall stretched on forever, the source of the noise always just out of reach. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A figure. At the far end of the hall. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. My breath caught in my throat as I realized its face wasn't human. It was a void, empty and hollow, like staring into a bottomless pit. The eyes were black, without any trace of life. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The thing seemed to glide towards me, its footsteps silent, but the sound of its arrival still echoed in my ears. "Let me in," it whispered. I bolted, my legs carrying me back to my apartment faster than I could comprehend. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it and pressing my back against the cold wall. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of what I had just seen. I stayed awake all night, the sound of those footsteps still echoing in my head. The next day, I gathered my courage and told my neighbor, a sweet older woman who had lived there for decades. She just nodded, her face pale. "You saw it too, didn't you?" she said quietly. It turned out I wasn't the only one who had experienced it. Several tenants over the years had reported similar occurrences, footsteps in the hall, the knocking, and that figure. But no one had ever gone into the hall long enough to see what was causing it. That night, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my things in the early morning, unable to shake the feeling that whatever was haunting that building had no intention of ever leaving. I left the keys on the kitchen counter and never looked back. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what was calling from the shadows, but I do know I don't ever want to find out again. It was the kind of evening where the sky seemed to press down on everything, as if it wanted to swallow the world whole. My friends and I had decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned lighthouse, miles from any town, where the cliffs stretched out over the ocean like they were reaching toward the sky itself. The lighthouse had been shut down decades ago, long before anyone could remember. We'd heard rumors that it was haunted, but we didn't believe in that kind of stuff. We just wanted an adventure. The road to get there was narrow, winding, and barely lit by a few flickering streetlights that flickered on and off like they were uncertain of their own purpose. We parked the car at the base of the cliffs and began walking toward the lighthouse. The air smelled of salt and decay, the kind of place where you feel like you've stepped out of time. The lighthouse stood there, looming and skeletal against the darkening sky. Its red brick tower stood like a sentinel, long forgotten, its windows cracked and covered in moss. We reached the entrance, a heavy metal door that creaked open with a groan. Inside, everything was covered in dust. The old lanterns hung from the walls, cobwebs stretched between them. The faint smell of mildew and dampness clung to everything. We walked up the narrow staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The higher we climbed, the darker it got. The dim light from the lanterns barely illuminated our path. I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, whispers, or maybe the creak of an old floorboard. Something to break the silence. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, and the soft shuffle of my friends behind me. Finally, we reached the top. The door at the top of the staircase creaked open, and we stepped out onto the balcony of the lighthouse. The wind hit us, sharp and cold, as we looked out over the cliffs. The ocean stretched out endlessly beneath us. The waves crashed far below, their roar distant and faint. The horizon stretched into nothingness, the darkness blending with the sea. We stood there, taking in the view, laughing and joking. We were miles from civilization, miles from anything that could disturb us. Or so we thought. That's when I heard it. The soft scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor below us. I turned to my friends, but they didn't seem to hear it. I figured it was the wind, some old creaking of the lighthouse settling into the darkness. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. This time, it wasn't below us. It was above. I froze, staring up toward the narrow spiral staircase that led to the top of the tower. The scraping noise was now followed by the faint sound of ragged breathing, labored and slow, like something struggling to draw in air. My hands trembled as I pointed upward. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but my voice was lost in the wind. My friends looked at me, puzzled. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on my mind. But then came the unmistakable sound of a voice, low and cracked, whispering something I couldn't make out. We were alone up there. I knew it. The others insisted it was probably the wind or some animal, but my instincts told me otherwise. I grabbed my friend's arm and whispered, "We need to get out of here." We turned, bolting down the staircase as fast as we could, the sound of our footsteps pounding in our ears. The scraping noise followed us, but it was closer now, louder. It sounded like it was climbing after us. When we reached the base of the tower, the door was still open. But what we saw outside wasn't normal. There was something standing by the car, something too tall, too thin, with its back bent unnaturally. It didn't move like a person. It was more like a shadow, stretching toward us in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, dark, and seemed to burn with a cold, inhuman light. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The others were frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figure turned its head slowly as if observing us, and then started to walk toward us. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't sure what it wanted. Without thinking, we bolted down the cliffside, the figure still behind us. The wind howled louder, but we didn't stop. We didn't stop until we reached the car and drove away, not looking back. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I haven't been able to go near that lighthouse since. Whatever was up there, waiting for us, still lingers in my mind. Some places I've learned are better left untouched.
But the wind didn't make whispers like that, soft, almost melodic, as if they were calling to me. When we reached the bottom of the trail, I was relieved to be back on solid ground. But as we were walking back to our car, something stopped me. I glanced back toward the lighthouse, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. At the top of the stairs, just for a split second, I saw a figure, a silhouette. It wasn't solid, more like a shadow against the fading light. It seemed to be watching us, standing perfectly still. My stomach twisted, and I called out to my friends, but they were already too far ahead. By the time they turned back, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep that night. Even now, weeks later, I still hear the whispers, sometimes faint and distant, like they're always just beyond my reach. The lighthouse may be gone, but whatever it is that watched us from the top, it's still out there. The stairs spiraled up the side of the cliff, worn and partially collapsed, but we made it to the top without much difficulty. The view was breathtaking, the vast expanse of ocean stretching out endlessly beneath us. We felt like we were on top of the world. As we explored the interior of the lighthouse, I noticed something strange. It wasn't just the cracked and broken furniture or the dust-covered rooms. There was an overwhelming sense of stillness. The air felt thick, and it seemed like the walls were watching us. It was then that we heard it, a faint, echoing sound, as though someone was whispering from far away. I stood still, straining my ears, trying to make sense of the noise. My friends didn't seem to notice, too busy taking pictures of the breathtaking view. "Did you hear that?" I asked, but no one seemed to respond. They brushed it off, assuming I was imagining things. But the sound wasn't just in my head, it was real, persistent, and getting louder. As we made our way back down, the whispers continued, growing louder, more distinct. I tried to keep calm, convinced that it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But the wind didn't make whispers like that, soft, almost melodic, as if they were calling to me. When we reached the bottom of the trail, I was relieved to be back on solid ground. But as we were walking back to our car, something stopped me. I glanced back toward the lighthouse, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. At the top of the stairs, just for a split second, I saw a figure, a silhouette. It wasn't solid, more like a shadow against the fading light. It seemed to be watching us, standing perfectly still. My stomach twisted, and I called out to my friends, but they were already too far ahead. By the time they turned back, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep that night. Even now, weeks later, I still hear the whispers, sometimes faint and distant, like they're always just beyond my reach. The lighthouse may be gone, but whatever it is that watched us from the top, it's still out there. I didn't look back, couldn't. The sound of my footsteps faded into the endless crashing of waves. But the figure was still there, moving, growing closer with every step I took. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled to start the engine, my hands trembling. When I finally glanced up, the figure was gone, but I swear, I still feel its eyes watching me. Every time I close my eyes, I can see it. It's not something I can explain, but I know one thing for sure: it wasn't human. The sun had long since set, leaving behind nothing but darkness. I carried a flashlight, but barely needed it, as the faint glow of the moon guided me enough. The beach was deserted, just the way I liked it. I walked for what felt like hours, letting my thoughts wander with the rhythm of the tide. The waves lapped gently at the shore, creating a hypnotic sound that had always brought me a strange sense of calm. But that night, something felt off. The air wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. I kept glancing over my shoulder, a nagging sense of unease growing with each step. It wasn't until I reached the far end of the beach, where the sand met jagged rocks and the sea stretched out endlessly, that I noticed it. A figure, not far from where I stood, barely visible in the dim light. There was someone or something standing still, staring out at the ocean. I froze. My first thought was that it was another walker like myself, maybe someone else who had come to enjoy the solitude of the beach. But as I tried to make out more details, my stomach twisted in knots. The figure didn't move, it was just standing there, unmoving, as if frozen in time. The longer I stared, the more I felt the weight of its gaze. Though I couldn't make out any features, a chill ran down my spine. But I told myself to keep walking. There was no reason to panic. It could have been anyone, right? But as I took a step forward, the figure shifted slightly, turning ever so slightly in my direction. It wasn't a human movement, there was something unnatural about it, jerky and deliberate, like a puppet controlled by strings. The urge to turn and flee was overwhelming, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart pounding. The figure continued to stare at me. There was no recognition, no sign of life, just that unrelenting, lifeless gaze. Then, without warning, the figure took a slow step forward. My body finally responded, and I turned and ran. I didn't look back, couldn't. The sound of my footsteps faded into the endless crashing of waves. But the figure was still there, moving, growing closer with every step I took. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled to start the engine, my hands trembling. When I finally glanced up, the figure was gone, but I swear, I still feel its eyes watching me. Every time I close my eyes, I can see it. It's not something I can explain, but I know one thing for sure: it wasn't human. I was visiting my grandfather's old farmhouse for the first time in years. The place had always been abandoned since he passed, but after years of avoiding it, my family decided it was time to clear it out. I wasn't expecting much, but something about that house made me uneasy the moment I stepped onto the overgrown property. The farmhouse was large and creaky, surrounded by nothing but fields and distant woods. It looked like something straight out of a horror story, wooden siding weathered and worn, windows cracked, and the door hanging on rusted hinges. My parents, my siblings, and I split up to sort through the decades-old belongings scattered around. There were stacks of dusty boxes, old furniture covered in tarps, and layers of cobwebs hanging in corners. It smelled like mildew and age. I wandered upstairs, away from the others, to explore the bedrooms. Each room was filled with relics of the past, faded photographs of relatives I didn't recognize, yellowed books, and cracked mirrors reflecting empty rooms. I didn't like the silence. It felt oppressive, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting. In the master bedroom, I found an old chest at the foot of the bed. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it open. Inside, I found old letters, some faded and crumbling, others half legible. Most were addressed to my grandfather, signed with names I didn't know. But one letter stood out, handwritten, crisp despite the years. Whoever finds this, beware. There is more in this house than dust. Things linger here, things that shouldn't be. I froze, reading it over and over. It wasn't signed, just a vague warning. Shivers ran down my spine. I told myself it was just an old family superstition, nothing more, but the words stuck with me. Later, after everything was packed, we all gathered outside to say goodbye. As we stood there, the sky grew darker, clouds rolling in from the distant horizon. My parents were talking about calling it a day, but I lingered, staring at the house. The silence returned, but it felt heavier than before. Just as I was about to walk away, I heard a soft, unmistakable creak. The sound came from inside the house, a slow, deliberate creak, like someone shifting their weight. My heart jumped into my throat. I spun around, expecting someone to come out, but no one was there. I stayed still, my breath shallow, as the creaking continued. It wasn't just a sound, there was something behind it, something inside. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Then, through the corner of my eye, I saw a figure. It wasn't human, more of a shadow, long and gaunt, peering through one of the upstairs windows. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me with hollow, empty eyes. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the ground. The shadow remained there for what felt like an eternity, unmoving, until finally, it vanished. The creaking stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally turned back to my family, they were already halfway to the car. I followed, my heart still racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from inside the house, something that had never left. It started on a lazy Sunday afternoon, when I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood park. It wasn't a grand park by any means, just a quiet, well-worn path surrounded by tall, rustling trees. I'd always found peace there, away from the noise of the city. But that day felt different. The air was cool, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. I walked deeper into the woods, far from the usual crowded picnic areas. The silence was comforting, or so I thought. The chirping of birds had faded, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my feet and the faint rustling of branches above. I noticed something unusual: footprints. They were fresh, clearly defined, leading deeper into the woods. At first, I thought it might have been someone else enjoying the peaceful afternoon, but there was something strange about them. They were small, as if made by a child, but too perfectly spaced, as if they had no owner. I shrugged it off. Maybe some wildlife had wandered through, or perhaps another hiker was more adventurous than I was. I pressed on, my curiosity growing. The path narrowed, and soon I found myself surrounded by tall trees that loomed overhead. The light faded quickly, casting eerie shadows around me. I began to feel uneasy. Every creak of the branches overhead seemed louder, and my footsteps felt heavier, like they were echoing in an empty void. Then I heard a faint whisper. It came from somewhere ahead, drifting through the trees like a cold breeze. The words were indistinct, but I could feel their presence more than I could hear them. My pulse quickened as I slowed my pace, straining to make sense of what I was hearing. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though still incomprehensible. I stopped, listening, my heart thudding in my chest. The whispering wasn't just words, it was something else entirely. It sounded almost like laughter, but not human. The sound seemed to echo through the trees, coming from all around me, bouncing off the bark and rustling leaves. Panic began to creep in. I wanted to turn back, but something compelled me forward. The whispers had turned into faint, chilling laughter, distant but unmistakable. I tried to reassure myself, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal, but the sound didn't fade. It was deliberate, as if whatever was making that noise was toying with me. I kept walking, faster now, heart pounding harder. The trees became thicker, the light dimmer, my breath fogged in the cool air. I felt as though I were being watched from all sides. The laughter continued, distant, but growing closer. My vision blurred as I stumbled over a root, falling to my knees. I didn't want to turn around, but I could feel something behind me, something watching. I forced myself to stand, gripping a tree for balance. I didn't want to look back. I couldn't, but the laughter was no longer distant, it was right behind me, echoing from the shadows. I could feel its presence, right at the edge of my vision, as though it were breathing down my neck. Go. The whisper hissed in my ear, though there was no one there. I could feel its breath, cold and damp, against my skin. The voice wasn't human, it was hollow, ancient, and wrong. I stumbled forward, unable to run, unable to escape the feeling that something was right behind me, watching, waiting. I could hear the laughter, growing louder, more insistent. I began to sprint, my feet slipping on the damp earth. The woods stretched endlessly, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from whatever had followed me. I burst out of the trees and back into the clearing, gasping for breath. I turned, heart still racing, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, the trees, and the fading sound of that laughter. Carried away by the wind, that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been with me in those woods. The laughter still echoed in my ears, and I couldn't sleep. My mind haunted by the memory of that voice, that presence, that wasn't truly there. To this day, I avoid that park. Something in those woods followed me, and I know I'll never forget it. It was a late summer evening when we decided to take the old railway tracks that ran parallel to the edge of town. They were no longer in use, left to rust under the weight of time. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the tracks as we walked. The air was warm, tinged with the faint scent of wildflowers and dried grass. There were 5 of us, me, my 2 friends, and a couple from the neighboring town we had just met. We'd agreed to take the tracks all the way to the old bridge that had been abandoned for decades. The bridge was famous, or perhaps infamous, for its history. He was too far away, but I could see his posture, his head tilted oddly. "Alex!" I screamed, but my voice felt swallowed by the silence. The figure was closer now, much too close. Alex took another step, and then he vanished, just like that. One moment he was there, and then the air shifted, and he was gone. I could barely breathe. The others were running towards me, shouting my name, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. My mind was still locked on the spot where Alex had been. "Alex!" I screamed again, my throat raw, but there was no response, nothing. The figure, whatever it was gone, and so was Alex. The others were examining it, laughing at the words we couldn't quite make out, but I noticed something else. The tracks ahead looked wrong, too quiet, too still. It was the silence that struck me most. No birds, no distant sounds of life, just that oppressive stillness. As we approached the old bridge, we could see it stretched out ahead, suspended over the river. The wooden planks were rotting, creaking in the breeze. It had the kind of haunted feel that only time and neglect could bring. There were stories, whispers, of people vanishing near the bridge, of strange shapes moving in the shadows beneath. Standing at the edge, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something about the air felt heavy, as if it were pressing down on us. My friends were still joking, but I felt that same distant sensation, the one that prickled my skin like I wasn't supposed to be there. We hesitated for a while, unsure whether to cross. My friend, Alex, laughed and started walking onto the bridge, saying he wanted to check it out. We didn't stop him, curiosity was too strong. But something about his figure standing there, silhouetted against the twilight, made my stomach turn. I stayed behind, watching from the shore, my eyes locked on him. The others were still further down the tracks, chatting and laughing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That's when I saw it movement, just beyond the bridge. A figure. At first, I thought it was Alex, maybe playing some kind of prank. But as I squinted, the figure didn't seem right. It wasn't human. It wasn't a person. The shape was too tall, too thin. Its head didn't move like a normal person's, jerking unnaturally as if it didn't belong in this world. I called out to Alex, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. The figure remained, watching him. I yelled again, louder, but there was no response. I looked back at the others, who had finally started to notice my panic. One of them, Emma, looked at me with a frown. "Is everything okay?" she asked, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It took a step forward, just one slow, deliberate step, and I watched in horror as Alex turned to face it, his back to me. He was too far away, but I could see his posture, his head tilted oddly. "Alex!" I screamed, but my voice felt swallowed by the silence. The figure was closer now, much too close. Alex took another step, and then he vanished, just like that. One moment he was there, and then the air shifted, and he was gone. I could barely breathe. The others were running towards me, shouting my name, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. My mind was still locked on the spot where Alex had been. "Alex!" I screamed again, my throat raw, but there was no response, nothing. The figure, whatever it was gone, and so was Alex. My mind was screaming in panic. I could still hear the creature, its unsettling sounds echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was far from that barn, my car speeding down the empty road. When I dared glance in my rearview mirror, there was nothing. No barn, no creature, just the empty, desolate road stretching behind me. I still don't know what I saw that day, or what it was that had been hiding in the darkness. I never went back to that place. I don't need to, because some things are better left unknown. One path stretched ahead, wide and inviting. The other disappeared into the trees, barely a trail. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to take the less traveled path, the one that felt like it might lead to something hidden, something forgotten. The further I drove, the deeper the trees became, until the road was almost completely blocked by thick branches. My car slowed to a crawl, crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. It was getting darker now, the sun almost gone, leaving behind only the faint light of dusk. I kept going until I reached what appeared to be an old barn, rotting wood and a sagging roof. It stood isolated in a clearing, its once bright red paint now faded to a dull gray. Curiosity got the better of me, and I parked beside it. I stepped out, the quiet almost deafening. I walked towards the barn, the wood creaking beneath my feet. The door was hanging open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest as I pushed it. Inside, The air was thick with the smell of decay. Dust floated in the dim light filtering through cracks in the roof. It felt as though no one had stepped inside for years. I explored the barn, half expecting to find some long-lost treasure or a relic from a bygone era. Instead, I found remnants of a past that didn't seem so distant. Rusted tools, empty cages, and old hay scattered across the floor. There was something wrong about the stillness. Then, from the far corner of the barn, I heard a soft, rasping sound. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was faint, but distinct, like something was breathing. Slowly, I turned toward the noise, expecting to find nothing but shadows. But there, crouched in the farthest corner, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a dark shape blending with the shadows. But as I stared, I realized it wasn't human. Its form was twisted, its limbs too long and ungainly, moving in jerky, unnatural ways. I backed away, my mind screaming for me to run, but I couldn't look away. The creature, or whatever it was, stared at me with hollow, empty eyes. Its face was indistinct, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. Then, it moved. Slowly, as if unsure of itself, it began to rise, its movements erratic, like a marionette with broken strings. I turned and bolted for the door, my breath ragged, the sound of its footsteps echoing behind me as I ran back to my car. I didn't dare look behind me. My mind was screaming in panic. I could still hear the creature, its unsettling sounds echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was far from that barn, my car speeding down the empty road. When I dared glance in my rearview mirror, there was nothing. No barn, no creature, just the empty, desolate road stretching behind me. I still don't know what I saw that day, or what it was that had been hiding in the darkness. I never went back to that place. I don't need to, because some things are better left unknown. And yet, I felt drawn to them, as though they were speaking directly to me. The whispers were no longer whispers. They had become a chorus of voices, chanting and echoing through the room. I could hear them clearly now, clear as if they were standing beside me. In that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. I slammed the book shut, my mind racing. The whispers faded, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I grabbed the nearest light and ran. Back to the store, back to the exit, not daring to look behind me. As I reached the front door, I heard it the same tapping sound, closer than before. I didn't stop to turn around. I just ran, faster than I ever thought possible, until I burst out into the night, gasping for air. The bookstore was still behind me, standing in the silence of the empty street. And though I couldn't hear the whispers anymore, I knew they were there waiting, lurking in the shadows, always watching. I never went back, and I hope I never will. The windows were dust-coated, and the only sound was the occasional tick of the clock. That night, I arrived, greeted by the dull hum of the ceiling fan. The store was more of a maze than anything else, filled with narrow aisles and towering stacks of books. It was strangely peaceful, and for the first couple of hours, I enjoyed the quiet, keeping myself busy restocking shelves, straightening books, and tidying up. But as the hours passed, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with a faint whisper, just at the edge of my hearing. I froze, listening intently, but there was nothing there. I dismissed it as the creaking of the old building. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the counter, trying to calm myself. It's nothing, I told myself, but the whispers didn't stop. They weren't just echoes, they were something else, something wrong. They weren't meant to be there. I checked my phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. I was miles away from civilization, with only the dark streets outside and the abandoned bookstore around me. Then, I heard a soft tapping, coming from deep within the store. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing louder with each step. The whispers seemed to grow louder, circling me, as though they were drawing me in. At the end of a dimly lit aisle, I found a small door tucked behind a shelf of old, dusty novels. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the counter, trying to calm myself. "It's nothing," I told myself, but the whispers didn't stop. They weren't just echoes, they were something else, something wrong. They weren't meant to be there. I checked my phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. I was miles away from civilization, with only the dark streets outside and the abandoned bookstore around me. Then, I heard a soft tapping, coming from deep within the store. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing louder with each step. The whispers seemed to grow louder, circling me, as though they were drawing me in. At the end of a dimly lit aisle, I found a small door tucked behind a shelf of old, dusty novels. I hesitated, heart thudding in my chest. My breath came quicker as I pushed the door open slowly. Inside, it was cold or freezing. In fact, the whispers filled the air, louder and clearer now. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were words. Words I couldn't make out, but they sounded like they were murmuring to me, calling me. I stepped further inside. The room was filled with books, hundreds, thousands of them, but they were unlike any I'd seen before. The spines were cracked, the pages yellowed with age, covered in symbols and strange, unreadable scripts. Some seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light, as if they had their own pulse, their own life. One book caught my eye larger than the rest, almost glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and opened it. The words inside weren't just text. They weren't words at all. They were something else, symbols, patterns, things I couldn't comprehend, and yet I felt drawn to them as though they were speaking directly to me. The whispers were no longer whispers. They had become a chorus of voices, chanting and echoing through the room. I could hear them clearly now, clear as if they were standing beside me. In that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. I slammed the book shut, my mind racing. The whispers faded, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I grabbed the nearest light and ran. Back to the store, back to the exit, not daring to look behind me. As I reached the front door, I heard it, the same tapping sound, closer than before. I didn't stop to turn around. I just ran, faster than I ever thought possible, until I burst out into the night, gasping for air. The bookstore was still behind me, standing in the silence of the empty street. And though I couldn't hear the whispers anymore, I knew they were there waiting, lurking in the shadows, always watching. I never went back, and I hope I never will. It was meant to be an ordinary day at the beach. I had been looking forward to it all week. The sun, the sound of the waves, the smell of salt in the air. I left the city early with a few friends, and we drove out to the coast. It was early enough that the beach was empty, just the way I liked it. We set up our towels, unpacked snacks, and played music while the waves rolled in and out. As the sun climbed higher, we swam and joked, letting the waves carry us like we were kids again. The water was colder than usual, but it felt refreshing against the sweltering heat. After an hour or so, I noticed something strange. Just past the line where the water met the sand, there was an area where the waves seemed to break differently. It looked as if the water was churning, moving in slow, jerky circles. I squinted at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a man, probably in his early 30s. He was flailing, waves crashing over him, pulling him deeper. I pushed forward, the water tugging at my legs, and reached out. I grabbed his arm, but when I tried to pull him closer, he went rigid, staring past me, eyes filled with pure, unbridled terror. "Don't turn around," he screamed, voice choked and panicked. I froze, but I couldn't stop myself from turning my head. What I saw made my blood run cold. A dark shape had emerged from beneath the water. It moved as if it were made of liquid, its surface shifting and undulating like oil. To hollow, black eyes stared at me, and I could feel its gaze, icy and ancient. It was a man, probably in his early 30s. He was flailing, waves crashing over him, pulling him deeper. I pushed forward, the water tugging at my legs, and reached out. I grabbed his arm, but when I tried to pull him closer, he went rigid, staring past me, eyes filled with pure, unbridled terror. "Don't turn around," he screamed, voice choked and panicked. I froze, but I couldn't stop myself from turning my head. What I saw made my blood run cold. A dark shape had emerged from beneath the water. It moved as if it were made of liquid, its surface shifting and undulating like oil. To hollow, black eyes stared at me, and I could feel its gaze, icy and ancient. A gaping mouth split its face, filled with rows of jagged teeth. My breath caught, and the man screamed again. He pulled away from me, but it was too late. The water shifted, and he was gone, dragged under in an instant. The surface of the water settled as if nothing had happened, leaving only ripples behind. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the water, and scrambled to get out. I didn't even look at my friends, who were now staring at me, eyes wide with confusion and fear. I ran up the sand, heart pounding, the air around me thick with salt and panic. I didn't stop until I was safe in my car, locked inside, staring back at the beach. The ocean was calm again, nothing out of the ordinary, as if the man and the thing in the water had never been there. But I'll never forget the sound of his last scream or the black, hungry eyes that had looked at me from beneath the waves. They were still there, waiting, just below the surface. I had been driving for hours, taking the long way home from a visit to my grandparents. The farmland stretched out on either side of the road, a patchwork of fields that seemed to go on forever. With every turn, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that twisted like fingers reaching out to catch me. I was almost home when I noticed the old, rusted tractor sitting off to the side of the road. It hadn't been there before, and I found myself slowing down to take a closer look. The engine was covered in dirt, and weeds had grown up around its tires, like it had been abandoned years ago. I couldn't remember ever seeing it there, and I would have remembered, because I had driven down that road countless times. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if someone were watching me. I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a dark figure standing behind my car. The road was empty, and the fields were quiet except for the rustle of dry corn stalks in the wind. I scoffed at myself, muttering that I was being paranoid, and drove on. Just as I was about to turn onto my street, a strange noise caught my attention. It was a rhythmic thumping, like someone pounding on a hollow drum. I pulled to a stop, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The noise seemed to be coming from the field to my left, where the corn had grown tall and thick, forming an almost impenetrable wall. I stared into the dark expanse, my pulse quickening. The thumping was joined by an odd, gurgling sound, like water bubbling up through mud. A shiver raced down my spine as I realized the noise was moving, shifting closer to the road. I backed up a few feet, my eyes wide as I watched the edge of the field ripple like the surface of a pond. Then I saw it, a figure, distorted and half hidden by the corn stalks. It was tall, hunched, with limbs that bent in unnatural ways. Its head was tilted at an angle that made my stomach twist. I slammed the car into reverse and peeled away from the field, the thumping and gurgling growing louder behind me. My tires skidded as I spun around the corner and raced down my street. I didn't dare look back, but my rearview mirror showed the edge of the field, swaying as if something large had stepped into the road. My hands were shaking as I pulled into my driveway and jumped out, not waiting for the car to come to a complete stop. The front door creaked as I fumbled with my keys, barely managing to unlock it. I slammed the door shut behind me, pressing my back against it as my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The thumping had stopped, but now there was a new sound of scraping, as if something with long, Sharp Claws was dragging itself along the edge of the field. I peeked through the window, my heart leaping into my throat when I saw a shadow move past the porch light. It was tall, with limbs that stretched too far, its face obscured by the hood of a tattered coat. I could only see the edge of it, but I didn't need to see more to know that whatever was out there was not human. I reached for my phone, fingers trembling as I dialed the number for the police. The call didn't go through. I tried again, the screen showing a no-service message. The scraping grew louder, closer. It was coming up the steps, slow and deliberate. My mind raced, trying to think of what I should do. I had no weapon, no way of defending myself. The sound stopped just outside the door, and then a soft, wet thud followed by a dragging sound. I backed away, holding my breath as I watched the doorknob twist and shift, as if something was trying to turn it from the outside. The wood groaned as pressure was applied, and I feared it wouldn't hold. Suddenly, the pressure eased, and the sound of footsteps receded, fading back into the night. My heart pounded, but the silence was deafening. I waited, unable to move, until the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the field in a harsh, bright light. There was no sign of what I had seen the next morning. I found the front steps littered with long, dark claw marks, deep enough to splinter the wood, and when I looked out at the field, the cornstalks had been flattened, as if something heavy had moved through them. But most disturbing of all was the fresh, muddy handprint pressed against the window. The last thing I expected was to find myself stuck on the side of a remote highway in the middle of nowhere at 11 p.m., with my car sputtering and coughing at its last breaths. I slammed my palms against the steering wheel, trying to stifle a curse. The darkness outside seemed to fold in on itself, thick and oppressive, with only the dull beam of my headlights cutting a path into it. I stepped out of the car, the chill in the air seeping through my clothes. The road stretched on for miles in either direction, bordered by dense, whispering trees. The only sign of civilization was a rusted sign, half hidden by creeping ivy, that read Riverton 10 miles. With a resigned sigh, I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help. No signal. Great. The road ahead seemed endless, so I decided to start walking, hoping to find a gas station, a house, anything. I made it about a mile before I heard it. A faint sound, like laughter, but not the kind that comes from joy. This was sharp, guttural, almost animalistic. I froze, my heart drumming in my chest. There was no one around. The woods were still, except for the subtle creak of branches overhead and the soft rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, and pushed on. Then the laughter came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound. It was as if someone was dragging something heavy over the ground. I turned around, my eyes searching the dark, but there was nothing. The road was empty, the trees stood silent. I rubbed my arms to stave off the cold and continued walking. Faster now. The air seemed to change as I walked, becoming colder and sharper, like the knife edge of winter. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the feeling of something being wrong. The laughter stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps following me, just at the edge of hearing. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw only shadows that seemed to shift and dart away. Then, without warning, something moved in the woods. A figure stepped out from between two trees, tall and thin, with limbs that bent in unnatural ways. Its face was pale, almost luminescent in the moonlight, with eyes so black they looked like holes drilled into its skull. The thing tilted its head, and then it spoke, lost. My legs locked up, and I stood frozen in place. I couldn't find my voice, couldn't tear my eyes away from that hollow, grinning face. It took a step forward, the uneven gait making the ground creak beneath it. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The figure took another step, and I finally snapped out of my paralysis, turning and bolting down the road as fast as I could. The sound of heavy footsteps pounding behind me, matched by that terrible, hollow laughter, drove me forward. The road blurred past, my vision cutting out between stumbles. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst, until my legs were cramping and I couldn't tell if the thud behind me was my own heartbeat or something chasing me. I didn't look back. I knew if I did, I wouldn't be able to move. Then, suddenly, there was light dim and flickering. A street lamp, old and cracked, stood at the edge of the road. I scrambled toward it, the warm glow embracing me, a sanctuary from the cold. The laughter and footsteps stopped. Silence. I dared a glance behind me. Heart still racing, there was nothing but the night. The road was empty. The street lamp buzzed and flickered before dying, leaving me in a pitch-black void again. But then, a voice, "Need a ride." I whirled around, eyes wide. A truck sat at the end of the road, headlights on, engine purring. The driver's face was obscured in shadow, but the voice was familiar, as if I'd heard it before. A hand reached out, fingers long and thin, with skin that seemed too tight, to pale. My blood froze as I recognized it. The laughter returned, only it was my own voice, twisted and distorted, echoing from somewhere in the dark. I was on my way to visit an old friend who lived on a small farm at the edge of town. The directions he gave were simple enough, and the scenery was beautiful, the hills rolling and dotted with wild flowers. But as the sky deepened to a dusky purple, a strange feeling crept up my spine. The road twisted and turned, narrow enough that my car brushed the bushes on either side. The trees grew thicker, their branches weaving together like a canopy, blocking out most of the light. I knew I was close, just a few more bends, when something caught my eye. A figure stood at the side of the road, half hidden in shadow. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching, and my heart leapt into my throat. The figure didn't move. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a man, but his body was bent at an unnatural angle, as if he were being held up by invisible strings. His arms hung limp, fingers brushing against the dirt. His head turned slowly, jerking around as if on a swivel, and his eyes met mine through the glass. The look in them was not human, black and wet, with a depth that seemed to reach inside me and pull. I couldn't breathe, before I could scream or drive away. He raised one arm and pointed directly at my car. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I hit the gas, speeding around the curve and desperately trying to tell myself it was just a hallucination or some poor, lost soul. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, but I ignored it. I needed to get to safety, to the farm, to my friend. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw him there, just behind the car, staring with those black, soulless eyes. I blinked, and he was gone. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway of the farm, I slammed the car door and ran up to the porch. The house was quiet, dark with no light spilling through the windows. I knocked, my knuckles hitting the wood like a drumbeat. No answer. Panic clawed at my chest, and I knocked harder, shouting his name. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, eyes wide, searching the dark yard. The air was damp and cold, and I could see my breath curling in the faint moonlight. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a movement, a figure stepping out from behind the barn. It wasn't my friend. It was him, the man from the road, his body still bent at that unnatural angle. He stepped forward, and as he moved, his limbs made wet, snapping sounds. The same dark, black eyes stared at me. Before I could run, he raised his arm again and pointed a gnarled finger toward the house. The light in the window flickered and blinked out, leaving only darkness. The air seemed to shift, heavy and suffocating, and the yard was filled with a sound I can only describe as whispering hundreds of voices, too quiet to make sense of. But the tone was unmistakable. I turned and bolted for the door, twisting the handle until it nearly broke. Inside, the house was still dark, cold, as if no one had lived there for years. I swept my phone across the room, and its light illuminated something that made my blood freeze. On the wall, written in what looked like smeared ash, were the words, "He's waiting for you." I could feel the presence of something intangible, like it was breathing down my neck. Sam grabbed my arm again, this time with desperate force. We sprinted, zigzagging through the garden until we finally burst through the main entrance, gasping for air. The night outside felt different, safer, as if we'd left the garden's grip behind. We didn't stop until we were back at my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away, the garden shrinking in the rearview mirror. But it wasn't until I got home and checked the back seat that I found it a small, wrinkled flower. One I had never seen before, sitting on the seat like an unholy offering. The voice echoed in my ears, an echo that would stay with me forever. Not so fast. The sun had just slipped below the horizon, leaving us in a twilight that made everything appear more vivid. It was there, in the middle of a patch of wild flowers, that I noticed something strange. The flowers were moving. I blinked, thinking it was just the wind, but the motion was rhythmic, like breathing. "Did you see that?" Sam asked, squinting at the patch. I nodded, but before I could say anything, there was a shuffling sound behind us, something small moving through the grass. We turned quickly, eyes searching the darkening garden, but it was empty. I laughed nervously, probably a raccoon or something, but Sam didn't look convinced. His eyes were fixed on the path we just walked down. A sudden chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as the cool of the evening. We decided to head back, but as we retraced our steps, I noticed that the garden was eerily quiet. The usual chirp of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl were gone. I stopped walking, listening hard. The silence was thick, suffocating. Then came the sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow steps coming from the direction we had just left. They weren't the light, scuttling steps of an animal, but the deliberate thud of boots against the stone path. My blood ran cold as I glanced at Sam. His face was pale, eyes wide. "Let's go," he whispered, grabbing my arm. We started to run, but the footsteps quickened, matching our pace. It was as if someone, or something, was shadowing us, step for step. The garden paths twisted and turned, dark shapes looming over us as we tried to find the exit. We reached a clearing and stopped to catch our breath. That's when I heard a low voice, raspy and wet, whispering from the shadows, "Not so fast." My heart raced as I spun around, searching for the source. There was no one there, but the whisper had come from just behind a massive oak tree. I could feel the presence of something intangible, like it was breathing down my neck. Sam grabbed my arm again, this time with desperate force. We sprinted, zigzagging through the garden until we finally burst through the main entrance, gasping for air. The night outside felt different, safer, as if we'd left the garden's grip behind. We didn't stop until we were back at my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away, the garden shrinking in the rearview mirror. But it wasn't until I got home and checked the back seat that I found it a small, wrinkled flower. One I had never seen before, sitting on the seat like an unholy offering. The voice echoed in my ears, an echo that would stay with me forever. Not so fast. It started with a simple invitation, a weekend trip to the lake. A friend of mine had rented an old boathouse by the water, a place where families used to go decades ago before it fell into disrepair. The photos she sent showed a charming, rustic building with peeling paint and weathered wood, a quaint escape from our busy lives. I was hesitant, but the promise of clear skies and warm summer nights was too tempting to pass up. When we arrived, it was everything I expected, quiet and isolated. The boathouse was perched at the edge of a small, serene lake surrounded by pines. The water was dark and calm, with just the occasional ripple from a fish or a breeze. It was perfect. We spent the first day swimming, eating grilled food, and laughing until our sides hurt. As the sun set, we sat on the old dock, feet dangling in the cool water. The sky turned a deep orange, then purple, and the stars began to blink into existence above us. We shared stories and let the night embrace us. The trouble started as the moon crested over the trees. At first, I thought I was imagining it a movement at the edge of the water, something slithering just below the surface. It looked like a shadow shifting beneath the lake, but it was too large to be just a fish. I pointed it out, but no one else saw it. They laughed, saying I was tired, seeing things, but the movement didn't stop. I watched, transfixed, as the shadow seemed to grow, twisting and pulsing beneath the surface. It was then that I noticed the soft, wet scraping of something brushing against the wooden posts of the dock, almost like a faint whisper. I stood up, heart pounding. "Do you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The laughter stopped. We all listened, and that's when we heard it, a deep, low gurgle from under the water, followed by the sound of something heavy sliding across the boards. A chill settled into my bones. I backed up as the water near the edge of the dock rippled, and then something broke the surface. It was dark and slick, like oil, and it moved like a snake, but with long, skeletal limbs that reached out and curled toward us. We screamed and scrambled to the shore, my feet barely finding purchase on the slick rocks. One of my friends tripped, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought she'd be dragged back into the lake. But she caught herself, and we all stumbled up the path leading to the boathouse. We slammed the door shut, panting and wide-eyed. We didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity, only the sound of our ragged breathing filling the small room. I glanced out the cracked window and saw that the water was now perfectly still again, reflecting the moon like glass. We didn't sleep that night, huddled together and watching the water, expecting the creature to return. It was only as dawn approached that we dared to let out a collective breath. But when we looked out again, there was no sign of anything unusual. The lake was just a lake, calm, quiet, and innocent. It wasn't until we were packing to leave that I noticed something on the dock. The boathouse was perched at the edge of a small, serene lake surrounded by pines. The water was dark and calm, with just the occasional ripple from a fish or a breeze. It was perfect. We spent the first day swimming, eating grilled food, and laughing until our sides hurt. As the sun set, we sat on the old dock, feet dangling in the cool water. The sky turned a deep orange, then purple, and the stars began to blink into existence above us. We shared stories and let the night embrace us. The trouble started as the moon crested over the trees. At first, I thought I was imagining it a movement at the edge of the water, something slithering just below the surface. It looked like a shadow shifting beneath the lake, but it was too large to be just a fish. I pointed it out, but no one else saw it. They laughed, saying I was tired, seeing things, but the movement didn't stop. I watched, transfixed, as the shadow seemed to grow, twisting and pulsing beneath the surface. The summer festival had been my favorite part of the year ever since I was a kid. It was a time of laughing crowds, bright lights, and sticky cotton candy. I had grown up in the town, and although I had moved away for a few years, I always made sure to return for the festival. This year, I was back with friends. We had just finished a round of rides when we decided to wander down to the edge of the festival grounds, where the old carnival games and food stalls ended, and the forest began. A wooden sign, painted in fading red letters, read, "Fortune's End. Step inside and see your future." The little shack was tucked between two tall oaks, with a lantern swinging above the door, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance. "You going in, or what?" my friend Alex said, nudging me with an elbow. He was grinning, his dark hair tousled from the wind. "I don't know. It looks weird," I replied, hesitating. The others urged me on, laughing and shoving me toward the door. I pushed it open, the small bell above tinkling as I entered. Inside, it was dark, the air smelling of old wood and incense. A woman sat behind a beaded curtain, her back to me. She turned slowly, revealing deep-set eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. "Welcome," she said, voice soft and melodic. "You've come for the truth." I hesitated but nodded. The beads behind her parted, and she beckoned me forward. I sat at the table, and she laid her gnarled hands over a deck of cards. "Your future is a path already chosen," she whispered, drawing a card and placing it face down. "But you may not like what it holds." Her eyes locked onto mine. I felt a sudden chill run up my spine as she flipped the card. The image was of a lone figure, standing in the dark, face hidden beneath a black hood. "Darkness follows you," she said. "Be wary of the night." Before I could respond, a voice called out from behind me, double quotes, "Hey, are you done in there?" It was Alex, knocking on the door. I turned back to the woman, but the room was empty. The cards were gone, and the lamp had dimmed. "Yeah, let's go," I said, stepping out and shaking off the unsettling feeling. But the night had changed. It felt heavier, as if a storm was coming. The others were waiting near a hot dog stand. As I joined them, I noticed the crowd had thinned. The air was dense and silent except for the distant clinking of a carnival ride. We started walking back toward the main square, but something felt wrong. A figure caught my eye, a man in a long coat, standing at the edge of the woods. I froze, but he disappeared into the darkness before I could get a good look. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Alex turned, his smile fading. "See what?" "Never mind," I muttered, trying to shake it off. But I kept glancing back, expecting to see the man again, waiting just beyond the reach of the lights. We reached the square, but everything was different now. The laughter was muffled, the lights flickered as if struggling to stay on. The festival felt like a set from a play, a hollow imitation of its former self. That's when I heard a soft rustling, like the sound of 100 leaves being shuffled. "My friend Alex," said, nudging me with an elbow. He was grinning, his dark hair tousled from the wind. "I don't know. It looks weird," I replied, hesitating. The others urged me on, laughing and shoving me toward the door. I pushed it open, the small bell above tinkling as I entered. Inside, it was dark, the air smelling of old wood and incense. A woman sat behind a beaded curtain, her back to me. She turned slowly, revealing deep-set eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. "Welcome," she said, voice soft and melodic. "You've come for the truth." I hesitated but nodded. The beads behind her parted, and she beckoned me forward. I sat at the table, and she laid her gnarled hands over a deck of cards. "Your future is a path already chosen," she whispered, drawing a card and placing it face down. I never thought a simple trip to the county fair would lead to a night I couldn't forget. The fairgrounds were full of lights and music, the sounds of laughter mingling with the creak of carnival rides. It was a warm evening in late summer, the kind that makes you feel alive. My best friend and I had come to eat cotton candy, play games, and ride the Ferris wheel. We were there to have fun. Nothing more. We wandered through the fair, stopping at booths and laughing as I tried to win a stuffed animal from a claw machine. We moved from ride to ride, each one a mix of joy and adrenaline. As the night grew older, the crowds began to thin, the lights reflecting in puddles left by the day's rain. That's when we saw a sign for an attraction we hadn't noticed before, a large tent with wonders of the unseen written across the entrance in faded, curving letters. I nudged my friend and said, "Why not? We haven't tried anything like this yet." He hesitated but agreed, and we stepped into the tent. The air was cool, the scent of damp canvas mixed with something metallic. Inside, a dimly lit space stretched before us, with rows of oddities on pedestals and glass cases. There were strange sculptures, eyes that seemed to watch you, and jars containing things that looked too grotesque to name. We wandered further, entranced by the bizarre display, until I noticed a small, unmarked glass case in the corner. Inside was a piece of paper, old and yellowed, with a single line scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. "Never turn your back on the silent one." A chill ran through me, and I glanced at my friend. He was staring at the case with wide eyes. "Did you see that?" he whispered, before I could reply. A sound came from the back of the tent. It was a soft thud, followed by a scraping noise that seemed to draw closer. I turned quickly, heart hammering, and saw nothing but shadows. I felt the weight of those unseen eyes, as if the entire tent had shifted, as if it were holding its breath. A sudden scream pierced the silence, coming from somewhere in the dark. My friend's hand gripped mine so hard that it hurt, but I didn't dare look away from the shifting shadows. The scraping sound was louder now, followed by a soft, guttural whisper. "Go, now!" The voice came from behind us. I spun around, and there, standing just a few feet away, was a figure in tattered clothes, its face obscured by a hood. The eyes that peered out from under the fabric were black and deep, a void that seemed to pull at my mind. The whisper came again. "Leave this place. Leave now." I yanked my friend toward the exit, but the tent seemed to stretch, the entrance impossibly far away. We stumbled over discarded objects and felt the air grow colder. The sound of footsteps behind us quickened, a wet, dragging shuffle. I didn't dare look back. I could feel it getting closer, an unnatural presence that made my skin crawl. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, we burst through the entrance and into the moonlit fairgrounds. The lights seemed brighter, the noise of the music and laughter louder, as if we had just woken up from a nightmare. We ran to the nearest food stand, gasping for breath, eyes darting back to the entrance of the tent. It was empty. The sign for Wonders of the Unseen now looked torn and tattered, barely hanging on its post. The tent had vanished, leaving only a dark patch of ground where it once stood. We didn't speak about what had happened that night. It was easier not to. But every now and then, when I hear a sound in the dark or feel something move just out of sight, I remember the whisper, the eyes, and the figure that stood in the shadows. Never turn your back on the silent one, and I know it's still out there. The summer I was 13, I stayed with my grandparents on their farm. It was a different world from the city. Vast fields stretching out beyond the horizon, towering corn stalks whispering in the wind, and that deep, oppressive silence that made you feel like you were the only person left on earth. I loved it, most of the time. But that summer, something changed. My grandpa was a man of few words, the kind who spoke only when he needed to. He'd tell me stories about the land, about the time the creek had overflowed and swallowed part of the cornfield, or the time he'd caught a raccoon stealing eggs. But there was one story he never told me, not until that summer. It was late in the evening, the sky streaked with bruised purple and fading orange. I had just finished helping Grandma with the dishes when Grandpa called me out to the back porch. He was staring at the woods that bordered their property, eyes squinting into the fading light. "Do you see that, boy?" he asked. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the tall, dark trees, their branches creaking in the breeze. "See what, Grandpa?" He didn't answer right away. Then he turned to me, his face serious. "There's something in the woods. Always there, waiting. I saw it when I was a boy, and I swore I'd never go back." I laughed nervously, but the look in his eyes made my laughter die in my throat. It wasn't like him to joke about things like this. I glanced back at the woods, a chill snaking down my spine. "You're just playing with me, Grandpa. There's nothing out there." "Are you sure about that?" His voice dropped to a whisper. I noticed then that the wind had stopped. The silence felt thick, suffocating. Suddenly, the wind picked up again, strong enough to rattle the old, wooden slats of the porch. That's when I heard a soft rustling coming from the woods, like something, or someone, was moving. I squinted into the twilight, heart pounding as I tried to make out any shape. But the trees remained still, their branches reaching like skeletal arms. "You need to go inside," Grandpa said, pushing me toward the door. There was something in his voice that made me hesitate. This wasn't like him. He was never afraid of anything. But there was a tension in his shoulders, a fear I'd never seen before. I didn't argue. I darted inside, casting one last glance at the woods before Grandma gently shut the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, eyes wide, listening to the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional creak of the old farmhouse. Then I heard the faint sound of footsteps just beyond my window. Soft, deliberate. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I got up slowly, heart pounding as I crept to the window and peeked outside. The moon was high, casting everything in silver light. And there, at the edge of the woods, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in impossible ways. Its head tilted, as if it knew I was watching, and it stared back at me with eyes that glowed a pale, sickly green. I backed away, breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled over the rug, hitting the floor with a thud. Grandma rushed in moments later, her face lined with concern. "What's wrong?" "Honey." I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the window, where the figure was now gone, swallowed back into the dark. The next morning, Grandpa was already up when I found him, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee. His hands were shaking slightly, and he avoided my gaze. "It comes every so often, but it's never this close," he said, voice barely above a whisper. I thought it had forgotten about us. It was then that I realized what he meant. The creature in the woods wasn't just a tale. It was real, and it was waiting for us to come out again. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat by the window, hoping against hope that whatever had watched me last night wouldn't come back. But I knew it would. I knew it was already out there, waiting for the next time the wind died down and the silence came, thick and suffocating. The sun had just set, painting the sky a deep, fiery orange when I arrived at my grandparents' old farmhouse. They had passed years ago, but I still visited their home to keep the place in good shape. My parents were out of town, and I thought it would be the perfect time to finish up some repairs and enjoy the peace and quiet of the country. The house was surrounded by fields of tall corn that creaked in the wind. The soft, rhythmic rustling made for a strange sort of comfort as I walked through the yard. But, as the night deepened, that comfort began to twist into something else, something cold. I was in the kitchen, trying to fix the sink when I heard the first sound, a soft, rhythmic thud, as if something were tapping against the side of the house. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just the wind against the wood. But then the thudding grew louder and more insistent, moving around the perimeter of the house. My heart skipped a beat as I turned off the tap and listened intently. The noise came from the back of the house, near the barn. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the counter, trying to steady my shaking hands. The light cut through the darkness in a narrow beam, illuminating the yard in jagged strips of silver and black. I took a step outside, the air suddenly colder. The crickets had stopped singing, and the wind had died down to a whisper. It felt as if the world was holding its breath. I aimed the flashlight at the barn and froze. The door, which had always hung slightly ajar, was now wide open, creaking as it swayed gently in the breeze. And standing in the doorway was a figure. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But then the figure moved, a tall, thin silhouette with long arms and a head that was too large for its body. It shifted, like it was trying to get a better look at me. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I took a step back. The barn door creaked again, this time louder, as if something had stepped forward into the moonlight. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. It was then that I realized the figure was holding something. A long, curved blade that caught the light and reflected it in a way that made my skin prickle. It pointed the blade at me, then tilted its head, as if curious. The silence was deafening. I stumbled backward and nearly fell over a rock. My flashlight hit the ground and rolled, the beam sweeping over the cornfield that surrounded the property. The movement caught my attention. There were more of them, figures emerging from between the stalks. Tall, thin shapes, all with strange, twisted limbs and empty eyes that glowed a pale blue in the moonlight. My breath quickened. I scrambled to pick up the flashlight. The figure in the barn didn't move, but the others in the cornfield did, closing in around the house. I knew I had to run, but my legs felt like lead. I aimed the beam of the flashlight at the nearest one, and it flinched back, letting out a sound that was somewhere between a hiss and a low, wet growl. I bolted toward the front of the house, racing past the porch and slamming my hand against the door. It creaked open just as I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The old lock clicked into place, and I pressed my back against the wood, gasping for breath. The thudding returned, only now it was inside, pounding against the walls and floor like 100 feet shuffling over the old wood. I turned and grabbed a rusty old poker from the fireplace, my knuckles white as I gripped it. Then the whisper came, so soft I almost didn't hear it. A voice, as thin as the wind, whispering in the dark, "Not done. Not done." I spun around, the flashlight catching a glimpse of a pale face pressed against the window, eyes wide and glowing like the figures outside. It mouthed the same words, over and over, and that's when I realized, whatever these things were, they were waiting for me to step outside. They wanted me to leave, to join them under the moonlight. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the cold silence of the night. The house seemed to breathe around me, its ancient wood creaking in time with my heartbeat. I dared a glance outside and saw nothing but the moonlit corn, swaying gently in the wind, but I knew they were still out there, lurking in the dark, waiting for the next moment I might open a door or step out of the safety of the house, and I knew I would never forget their eyes, those cold, empty eyes that glowed in the dark. I had never been a fan of driving long distances alone, but it was a rare chance to clear my head. My cousin's wedding was the next day, and I was determined to make it there. The route was scenic, winding through rolling hills and small towns that seemed frozen in time. As the sun began to set, I found myself in a stretch of road surrounded by dense woods with barely a sign of civilization. I pulled over when my phone buzzed, alerting me to a missed call. It was my cousin, reminding me of the directions and warning me that there would be no cell service in some areas. I laughed, thinking about how outdated that sounded, and tucked my phone away. That was the last sound I heard for a while. The road ahead curved into a darker part of the forest, the trees pressing in on either side like silent sentinels. As I drove, the headlights of my car bounced off the trunks, casting long, twisted shadows. I thought I saw movement up ahead, something darting just beyond the trees. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just a rabbit or a deer. But then I saw it again, a tall figure that looked like it had been molded from bark and leaves, standing just out of reach of the light. It moved, jerking with an unnatural rigidity, almost like it had been caught mid-step. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt as I stared into the dark. Nothing, just the forest and the dull thrum of my heartbeat. My hands were shaking as I started to drive again. The headlights barely cut through the twilight, and I swerved as I caught another glimpse of the figure, this time closer to the road. It was at the edge of my vision, a blur of movement. I didn't know if I should stop or keep going, but the road was empty behind me, and I couldn't risk turning around. Suddenly, my car's engine sputtered, and I watched in horror as the lights dimmed and then cut out altogether. The cabin of the car was plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the relentless thumping of my heart. I reached for my flashlight, feeling my palms turn cold as I fumbled to turn it on. A knock came from the driver's side window. My body froze, but my eyes went straight to the glass. A hand was pressed against it, long fingers reaching out with an unsettling rigidity. The skin looked rough, cracked, and speckled with dark patches. A face emerged, impossibly thin, with eyes that were wide and unblinking. It had a smile, but it was wrong. It was stretched too far, as though someone had pulled the corners of its mouth with hooks. I screamed, throwing the flashlight at the figure, but it was already retreating, melting back into the trees. The light illuminated the forest just long enough for me to catch sight of more figures. They emerged from the shadows like marionettes, limbs moving in angles they shouldn't, heads tilting back as if looking at something invisible. I grabbed my phone, praying for a signal. There was none. The figures started to close in, moving with a quick, unnatural shuffle. I unlocked the car door, my fingers trembling, and I stepped out into the gravel. The night air was sharp, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of branches snapping as the figures came closer. Then, the headlights of another car appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me as the vehicle pulled up, and a man stepped out, his face lit with concern. "Are you all right?" he called, glancing around nervously. I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the figures, the terror clawing at my throat. The man followed my gaze and looked back at me with wide, horrified eyes. "They're already here," he whispered, and then he was running, disappearing into the forest. The figures paused, their heads turning in unison to follow him, and I realized with a sickening jolt that they were all heading in the same direction toward the road where I had just been. My car roared to life as if in response, and I scrambled inside, slamming the door shut. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figures at the edge of the woods, watching. Their twisted faces held that same, stretched smile, and as they faded into the trees, I could almost hear them whispering a single word: run. It was supposed to be a simple day trip. My friends and I had decided to spend the afternoon exploring the cliffs overlooking the lake, a spot known for its breathtaking views and an old, rusted watchtower that people claimed had been abandoned for decades. None of us were prepared for what we'd find that day. The sun was warm, casting long golden light across the grass and trees. We parked at the edge of the hiking path and made our way toward the cliffs. The path was narrow and winding, with patches of moss that clung to the rocks like velvet. I shivered, and before I could say anything, Gabe let out a loud gasp. I turned to see him staring out into the distance, eyes wide with terror. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing at the water. My gaze followed, and I saw it, a figure, standing in the middle of the lake. It was too far to make out details, but it looked human, its arms outstretched, as if reaching for something. A thin mist was rising around it, curling in slow, ghostly waves. "What the hell?" I muttered. One of my friends, Mia, stepped beside me, peering over the edge of the tower. "It's probably just a log or something," she said, but her voice was strained. Her eyes locked on the figure that wasn't moving. A moment later, the figure turned its head, and we all recoiled as if struck. It was weather-beaten, its once proud frame now leaning precariously. The wood was splintered and gray, with vines curling around the base as if trying to hold it together. I hesitated at the base, a sudden chill running down my spine. The air felt heavier here, almost as if it were pressing in on me. "Are you coming or not?" Gabe called, already climbing up the rickety stairs. I followed him, my hands brushing against the rough wood as I took each step. The tower creaked under our weight, the sound echoing like a warning. When we reached the top, I took a deep breath and looked out over the cliff again, but this time, the beauty of the view was overshadowed by a strange feeling. The lake seemed darker, the surface like black glass now, mirroring the sky. Suddenly, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks of the tower. I shivered, and before I could say anything, Gabe let out a loud gasp. I turned to see him staring out into the distance, eyes wide with terror. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing at the water. My gaze followed, and I saw it, a figure, standing in the middle of the lake. It was too far to make out details, but it looked human, its arms outstretched, as if reaching for something. A thin mist was rising around it, curling in slow, ghostly waves. "What the hell?" I muttered. One of my friends, Mia, stepped beside me, peering over the edge of the tower. "It's probably just a log or something," she said, but her voice was strained. Her eyes locked on the figure that wasn't moving. A moment later, the figure turned its head, and we all recoiled as if struck. Its face was blank, pale as marble, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Then it moved, slowly, gliding across the surface of the water as if it were floating on air. "Run," Gabe said, his voice breaking. We bolted, scrambling down the stairs as fast as we could. The creaking and groaning of the wood seemed to echo the thumping of our hearts, louder with every step we took. When we reached the bottom, we didn't stop running. It was weather-beaten, its once proud frame now leaning precariously. The wood was splintered and gray, with vines curling around the base as if trying to hold it together. I hesitated at the base, a sudden chill running down my spine. The air felt heavier here, almost as if it were pressing in on me. "Are you coming or not?" Gabe called, already climbing up the rickety stairs. I followed him, my hands brushing against the rough wood as I took each step. The tower creaked under our weight, the sound echoing like a warning. When we reached the top, I took a deep breath and looked out over the cliff again, but this time, the beauty of the view was overshadowed by a strange feeling. The lake seemed darker, the surface like black glass now, mirroring the sky. Suddenly, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks of the tower. The night my world changed started like any other. My friends and I had decided to take an evening trip to the old observatory on the hill. It had been closed for years, abandoned. The last astronomer mysteriously vanished. Rumor had it the place was haunted, but we were young and reckless, ready for any thrill. We didn't believe the stories. The climb up the hill was steep and damp from an earlier rain, the air thick with the scent of moss and pine. The observatory loomed above us, its weathered stone walls cracked with age and covered in ivy that reached out like fingers. The sky was clear, a tapestry of stars, and the moon cast a ghostly glow over everything. Inside, the observatory was dark and silent. The main dome creaked under the weight of time, the giant telescope pointing skyward like a skeletal finger. We wandered through, laughing and daring each other to explore deeper into the building. It wasn't until we reached the old basement that things started to feel wrong. The temperature dropped, and a metallic scent filled the air. We exchanged uneasy glances, but curiosity pushed us forward. The basement was full of old equipment, charts, and abandoned papers scattered like leaves. At the far end was a door, half open, with the faint light seeping through the cracks. Before anyone could stop me, I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, cluttered with old photographs and a large, moth-eaten chair. But the strangest part was the mirror. It was an antique, with a frame carved from dark wood and intricate patterns that seemed to twist if you looked at them too long. I stepped closer, feeling a chill creep over my skin. "Hey, come on," Emily called from behind. "Let's get out of here." I nodded, but as I moved, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Only, it wasn't my reflection. The face staring back at me was pale and gaunt, eyes hollow and dark. It grinned, but it was not my smile. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. "There's something in the mirror," I whispered. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the air felt thick, as if something were pressing against my chest. A sound, like the faintest whisper, moved through the room. My friends crowded around, confusion and fear etched on their faces. "What is it?" Marcus asked, stepping forward. Before I could answer, the reflection in the mirror changed. It was no longer just a face, it was an entire scene, a vivid replay of a moment I didn't recognize. A man, hunched over and gasping, in the very room we stood in. His reflection stared at me, eyes wide with terror, as if he knew I was watching him. Then, without warning, his hand reached out, fingers splayed, as though trying to pull me in, get away from it. Emily screamed. I wanted to move, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The room shuddered, the floor creaking as though it were about to split open. A cold wind surged past me, carrying with it a voice that echoed in my mind. "Help me." I snapped back to reality, stumbling away from the mirror as it cracked, the glass shattering in a spray of sharp, jagged pieces. The chill lifted, and the room returned to its stillness. My friends were staring at me, fear radiating off them like heat. "What did you see?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. I looked around, not sure how to answer. The air felt normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the mirror was still there, waiting for me to return. We left the basement without speaking, the silence heavy between us. When we finally stepped out into the open night, the stars above felt colder, the moon more watchful. I never went back to that observatory, none of us did. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I catch my reflection in a dark window and see a pale, hollow-eyed face grinning at me from the glass. It's not just a reflection, it's waiting. It was the last day of summer, and I decided to take a bike ride out to the old bridge. It was a spot I'd been to countless times before, but something felt different that day. The sun was setting, casting a blood-orange glow over the horizon, and the forest surrounding the path whispered in the warm breeze. I'd been riding for nearly an hour when I noticed the silence. The birds had stopped singing, and the crunch of gravel under my tires was the only sound. I slowed down, glancing around nervously. The woods felt alive, but not in a comforting way. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. When I reached the bridge, I stopped to rest, propping my bike against the guardrail. Below, the river churned, swollen from weeks of rain. I leaned on the edge, staring down into the dark water, when I heard a faint splashing, as though someone, or something, was moving just below the surface. I squinted, trying to see. The sun was almost gone now, painting everything in shades of purple and indigo. I blinked, and then I saw it to pale, bony hands breaking the water, fingers clawing at the air. I stumbled back, nearly falling over my bike. A chilling, guttural moan rose up from the river, sending a cold wave down my spine. Before I could react, a figure burst out of the water, dragging itself up onto the bridge. Its skin was slick and glistening, half covered in river moss. Its eyes were wide and glassy, locked on mine with a stare that made my blood freeze. It moved with a lurching gait, limbs bending in impossible ways as it crawled forward. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead. The creature reached out, its fingers twitching, and for a moment I thought it would grab me. But then, a sudden roar echoed through the woods, deep and primal. The creature paused, its head tilting to one side as if it could hear something I couldn't. It let out a sharp, piercing screech, then turned and sprinted back toward the forest, vanishing into the trees with a speed that seemed to defy logic. I stumbled backward, scrambling to my feet and grabbing my bike. Adrenaline surged through me, pushing me forward as I pedaled down the path. The forest was alive with rustling and snapping branches, as if a whole army of things were moving behind me. I didn't dare look back. The ride back was a blur, the world around me reduced to the thumping of my heart and the rhythmic screech of crickets. I finally made it home, slamming the door behind me, locking it as if it would somehow protect me from whatever had emerged from the river. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing the sound of water splashing, the shrill scream echoing in my mind. It wasn't until the next morning, when I opened my front door, that I understood the horror of it all. On my porch was a trail of wet, muddy footprints leading from the edge of the woods, where the bridge was, to my doorstep. And in the center of the prints was a small, pale handprint, smeared and barely visible, as if someone had tried to reach out but hadn't quite made it. The woods were still and silent again. But I knew, deep down, that whatever had been in the river hadn't left, and it was still watching. The summer I turned 18, my cousins and I decided to spend the weekend at their grandparents' old farm. The house was on the edge of a small, sleepy town, surrounded by fields that stretched for miles and a patch of forest on one side. I had spent summers there when I was younger, but this time felt different. The place was darker. Somehow, even in the middle of the day, we arrived around mid-afternoon. The farm had a rusted, creaky metal gate that looked like it might fall apart if you touched it, and the paint on the house was chipped and faded. It had been a while since anyone had taken care of it. After we settled in, we explored the property, climbing trees, poking around the old barn, and chasing each other through the long grass. The scent of hay and earth clung to the air, sweet and sharp-dot. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky deepened into a rich, bruised blue. That was when we noticed the sound. It started as a low rumble from the woods behind the house, like the growl of distant thunder. But it wasn't quite right. It had a steady, pulsing rhythm to it, almost like footsteps. We looked at each other, nervous laughter escaping us as we tried to dismiss it. Probably just some wild animal, my cousin Peter said, though his voice wavered. But the noise grew louder, and we started hearing whispers, thin and rustling, coming from the woods. It was then that I realized there was a pattern to the noise, like someone was walking through the underbrush, trying to stay hidden but failing. We huddled together, trying to make sense of it. I was about to suggest we go back inside when the air turned colder, and a shadow fell across the yard. A figure stepped out of the forest. It was thin and bent, its limbs moving in jerky motions, like a marionette with tangled strings. I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, and its face came into view. It was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that were dark pits, as if they had been carved out. A low, rasping breath escaped its mouth, and it tilted its head, like it was studying us. Double quotes run. I whispered. We bolted for the house, hearts pounding in our chests. I could hear the figure shuffling behind us, the leaves crunching underfoot. We slammed the door shut, the lock clicking into place just as the figure reached it. For a moment, there was silence. Then came a sharp, scraping sound, like nails dragging down the door. We huddled in the dark, staring at the thin sliver of light under the door. The whispers came again, this time louder, more insistent. I felt a rush of cold air move across my skin, as though something was just inches away. The sound of scraping shifted to a loud thump. And then it stopped. We dared to breathe again, the fear making us dizzy. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. My cousins whispered about calling for help, but the landline in the kitchen was dead, the cord frayed and hanging limply. Suddenly, a soft knock came from the back door. Peter glanced at me, eyes wide, and whispered, "It's inside." We moved as a group to the kitchen, every step echoing in the silent house. I peeked through the cracked door, and the sight made my blood freeze. The figure was standing on the porch, staring at us through the glass. It didn't move, didn't blink. But then, its mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and it spoke in a voice like wind through dead branches. "You shouldn't have come back." We backed away, the noise of the night outside pressing in around us. The whispers returned, but this time, they were joined by a second voice, then a third. Shapes began to form in the windows, figures pressing their faces against the glass, eyes black and hollow. The next thing I remember is waking up in the middle of the yard at dawn, the others scattered around me. The house was silent, its doors and windows closed, as if nothing had happened. We checked every room, but there was no sign of the figures, no sound at all. But when I went to the window and looked out at the woods, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the trees, waiting. And I knew that, whatever had been there, it hadn't left. I was never one for nature. I didn't see the appeal of camping, roughing it in the woods, or being disconnected from my creature comforts. But when my friend suggested a weekend getaway at a remote, lakeside cabin, I felt like I had to go. It was a chance to reconnect with them, escape our busy lives, and experience something new. Or so I thought. The cabin was nestled at the edge of a small mountain lake. From the moment we arrived, the air felt heavy, thick with the scent of pine and something else, something sweet and almost sickly, that first night. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the lake became a sheet of glass, the sense of unease started to creep in. We sat around the campfire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. The dark pressed in around us, the forest seeming to move and shift with each gust of wind. I laughed along with the others, but my nerves were frayed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We turned in early, but I woke up just before midnight. The cabin was deathly quiet, the only sound the soft lapping of water against the shore. I shifted in bed, trying to go back to sleep, when I heard a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from the direction of the lake. I sat up, straining to hear. The thumping grew louder, like someone or something was walking through the water. My heart began to pound, and I reached for the flashlight on the bedside table. I stood and moved to the window, hesitating for a moment before pulling the curtains aside. A shape moved at the edge of the lake, just barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to bend and twist in unnatural ways. Its head was tilted back, and its mouth was open wide, emitting that thumping sound, like a heartbeat echoing in the stillness. I staggered back from the window, the flashlight falling from my grip. It landed with a soft thud, rolling until it was out of sight. My pulse raced, and I struggled to breathe. The figure moved toward the cabin, its limbs bending at impossible angles. The thumping grew louder, accompanied by a slithering sound, as if the thing was dragging itself across the ground. Before I could process what I was seeing, a sudden, sharp knock rattled the door. I froze, my body locked in place as my friends gradually called out from their rooms, asking if I was okay. The knocking stopped, and an icy wind swept through the cabin, extinguishing the last of the candles. I whispered to my friends, telling them to stay inside and stay quiet. I crept toward the front door, peering out through the gap in the wooden slats. The shape was no longer by the lake. It was at the porch, standing still, its twisted limbs bent in impossible ways, as if it were listening. Then, a voice, a deep, raspy whisper slithered through the air. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, and the sound made my skin crawl. The creature tilted its head and looked directly at me, eyes glowing with a cold, otherworldly light. Panic gripped me as I backed away, grabbing my flashlight and shining it toward the door. The beam caught the thing's face, and for a moment, I saw it clearly, a mass of jagged teeth, hollow eyes that seemed to peer into my soul, and a smile too wide for any human. Then it lunged, claws reaching through the gap in the door, and I screamed. I pulled the door open, stumbling outside as the creature lunged past me and into the night. It was gone in an instant, disappearing into the dark woods. We didn't stay. We packed up as quickly as we could, leaving behind the cabin and whatever it was that had haunted us. When we reached the main road, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting light across the forest in shades of gold and orange. We never spoke about what happened that night, but I still hear the sound of that thumping when I close my eyes. It's the last thing I hear before I fall asleep, and the first thing I remember when I wake. And every time I visit a lake, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure waiting at the water's edge. The sun had barely set when we pulled up to the abandoned amusement park. My friends and I had been searching for a thrill, a break from the mundane, and we had found it in the form of this long-forgotten place that was rumored to be haunted. Rusted Ferris wheel, peeling paint, and the creak of the roller coaster as it swayed in the wind. It was everything we wanted for a night of adrenaline and stories to tell. Or so we thought. As soon as we stepped through the entrance, the world seemed to tilt. The air smelled of dust and rusted metal, a sharp contrast to the sweet, overripe scent of the cotton candy machine that sat in the middle of the square. The remains of a merry-go-round stood crooked, its horses missing legs, as if they had been hastily torn from their posts. It was a scene pulled straight from a nightmare. We ventured deeper into the park, our laughter echoing off the warped concrete pathways. The merry-go-round was the first ride we dared to touch, the faded music box inside still winded, a single note stuck on loop. When I reached out to touch the unicorn's chipped horn, a chill crawled up my spine, and the air seemed to press against me, heavy and unnatural. "Don't tell me you're scared already," Sarah joked, nudging me with her elbow. I rolled my eyes, but the moment she laughed, it was swallowed up by the sudden screech of metal. We spun around, searching for the source. Nothing. The Ferris wheel loomed over us, its gondola swaying, though there was no wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. A sound like children giggling drifted through the night, so faint I wondered if I had imagined it. "All right, let's check out the haunted house," Chris said, pointing to the old building with cracked plaster walls. We made our way to it, the narrow path lined with weeds that clawed at our shoes. Just as we reached the door, it swung open with a loud thud, as if inviting us inside. "Welcome," a voice whispered. The three of us froze. The voice was low, almost mechanical, but unmistakably human. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. The only response was silence. We exchanged glances before Sarah stepped inside, the rest of us reluctantly following. The air grew colder as we moved through the dusty hall, the silence punctuated by the creaks and groans of the wood. I turned my flashlight on, sweeping it across cracked walls and broken mirrors. Reflections stared back at us, but something in them didn't feel right. One of the mirrors showed a version of Sarah with her eyes wide open in terror, as if seeing something that wasn't there. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "See what?" Chris said, turning toward me with a forced smile. The next room had a broken clown statue that was half buried in the floor. Its grin was painted in sickly yellow and green, and its eyes, once bright, were now dull and hollow. It seemed to watch us as we moved past. As we approached the exit, the door slammed shut behind us. We jumped, spinning around to see the hallway behind us was now filled with mist, the air impossibly cold. Then we heard it again, a giggle. A child's giggle. "Let's go, now," Sarah said, trying to push past Chris, who was frozen, staring into the dark. The giggle turned into a whisper, and then, like an echo, the whispers multiplied, filling the hallway with a chorus of voices. "Leave," they said. "Leave now." We all broke into a run, stumbling over each other as we tried to get out. The door creaked open on its own as we barreled through, panting and wild-eyed. As we stumbled outside, the wind picked up, and the old amusement park seemed to shudder, as though exhaling a long-held breath. We didn't stop running until we were back in the safety of the car, the park behind us like a shadow waiting to pull us back in. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw them. Dozens of pale, ghostly faces peering out from the broken windows of the haunted house, eyes wide, mouths agape in silent screams. The giggles followed us as we drove away, fading into the night, but they would never leave my mind. I hadn't planned on taking the shortcut through the old park that evening. It was late, just past sunset, and I was already tired from the long day. But as I glanced at the road ahead, I realized the shortcut would get me home faster. The park was empty. As usual, no lights, no children's laughter, nothing to break the silence of the early evening. The path was narrow, bordered by overgrown bushes and the skeletal branches of old trees. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and kept my eyes on the path. It was peaceful, almost peaceful. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot. That's when I heard the first noise, a soft, rhythmic thumping. I stopped, heart clenching. It came from deeper in the park, a few yards off the main path. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, but then it grew louder, a thudding that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I hesitated. I could turn around, go back to the road, but the thumping was joined by another sound, faint but unmistakable, a child's giggle. It was high-pitched and cheerful, like the kind of laugh that would echo through a playground, but there were no children in the park. I knew that as surely as I knew my own name. I forced my feet forward, telling myself I was just imagining things. The thumping continued, and the giggle grew louder. I passed an old, rusted swing set, its chains creaking as if moved by an unseen hand. My breath quickened as I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. I turned, and for a moment, I saw a figure small, dressed in white, standing at the edge of the woods. Its face was obscured by a curtain of hair. I didn't stop to think. I ran. I ran like I was being chased, the echoes of my footfalls mingling with the sounds behind me. The thumping had turned into pounding, a sound that seemed to follow me, no matter how fast I moved. I broke out of the park and onto the road, panting, my chest burning. The streetlights flickered on, casting their orange glow on the pavement. I dared a glance behind me, half expecting to see the figure from the woods. There was nothing, only the empty path winding through the park. When I reached my street, I didn't stop to check my mail or even look around. I dashed into my house, locked the door, and pushed a chair against it just in case. I stood there, trembling, telling myself it was just a bad dream, that the park was empty, that I was safe. The silence in the house was thick and absolute. But then I heard it again, the soft, rhythmic thumping, coming from outside my window. I looked out, heart slamming into my ribs, and there it was. The figure from the park, standing in the yard, staring at me. It tilted its head, and a smile spread across its face, a smile so wide, so impossibly twisted, that I felt sick. I backed away from the window, my fingers fumbling for my phone, but the thumping came again, louder this time, as if the ground itself were shaking. I glanced at my reflection in the glass, and for just a moment, I saw not my own terrified face, but that of a child, eyes wide and filled with dread. Then the window shattered. I don't remember running or what happened to that. I only know that the thumping, the giggling, and the figure were gone when I came to my senses, sprawled in my living room, the cold night air biting at my skin. The police found nothing when they came. No broken glass, no evidence of anyone in the yard. Just an empty house and a story I would never tell. Not because I was afraid people wouldn't believe me, but because I knew, deep down, that the next time I heard that thumping, it would be much, much closer. I was always the adventurous one. My friends would hesitate to try something new, but I couldn't resist. That's how I found myself at the edge of the old, abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. A place where kids once screamed in delight on the roller coasters and the smell of popcorn mingled with the scent of cotton candy. Now it was nothing more than a resting skeleton of forgotten joy. That it was late in the evening, just past twilight. The air was crisp and smelled of the city, mixed with something older and damp. My friends were hesitant, but agreed to follow me inside. We stepped through a gap in the fence, the iron links jagged and twisted. It wasn't as creepy as I'd expected, at least at first. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its painted wood faded and peeling, but the gentle creak it made as it swayed in the breeze seemed almost alive. We wandered from ride to ride, each one more decayed than the last. The bumper cars sat in their little enclosure, rusted, unmoving, their paint chipped and the windows cracked. We joked about the rides coming to life and scaring us, but the laughter was hollow, even to my ears. It was then we heard the first sound that made me stop in my tracks. A high-pitched giggle, faint, drifting from behind the funhouse. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years, not since childhood, when the park was still alive with laughter and lights. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I turned to my friends. They looked just as uneasy. "I think we should go," one of them said, but I brushed it off. "It's probably just the wind," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We moved towards the sound, my flashlight casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance with us. The giggle came again, louder, and I swore I saw something move behind the funhouse mirrors. I stepped forward, the creaking wood beneath my feet sending a jolt of nerves through me. The door to the funhouse was slightly ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. As I pushed it open, the air inside was colder, sharp and biting. The mirrors on the walls reflected our faces back at us, fragmented and twisted, making us look distorted and monstrous. But there was something else in the mirrors, something moving just out of sight. The way it moved felt wrong, jerky, sudden, as though its limbs didn't bend the right way. "Did you see that?" I whispered. The others nodded, wide-eyed, but no one spoke. We pressed on, each step louder than the last, our breath shaky and uneven. The giggling grew, a child's laughter that seemed to echo in 1,000 directions. A sudden crash behind us made us jump. I spun around, flashlight trembling, and the beam swept across the mirror at the end of the hall. For a moment, I saw it small, with dark, wild hair and eyes too big for its face. It wasn't a reflection. It was real, and it was watching us. We bolted, running past the cracked mirrors and warped carnival games. The laughter followed, sharp and manic. It didn't fade as we reached the entrance. It grew louder, as if we were being herded into a trap. We leapt over the fence and didn't stop running until we were back at the main road, panting, hearts racing. When we looked back, the amusement park stood as silent as before. No laughter, no shadows moving. The night felt suddenly too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I turned to my friends, trying to catch my own breath. "It was just a trick," I said, but the look on their faces told me they didn't believe that. None of us did. That was years ago. I don't go near the park anymore, but sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear that giggle. It's faint at first, just a whisper in the dark, then louder, like it's in the next room, behind the wall, as if it's always been there, waiting. And sometimes, I catch a glimpse of something in the mirror, something small and watching, with eyes too big for its face. The sun had just set as I drove down the narrow, winding road that led to my grandmother's house. I had come to visit her for the weekend, a rare trip to reconnect after years of living in the city. The countryside was always eerie at twilight, with fields that stretched out like dark, restless oceans and rows of trees that seemed to watch me as I passed. My grandmother's house stood at the edge of a small, overgrown field, surrounded by clusters of wildflowers that seemed to move in the wind like they were whispering secrets. The air was still and heavy, tinged with the scent of damp earth. As I pulled up, the porch light flickered, casting shadows that rippled across the wooden planks. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel underfoot sounding louder than it should have in the silence. The house seemed to sigh, its old wood creaking in protest as if it had been holding its breath. I knocked on the front door, and at the moment, my grandmother appeared in the doorway, a smile softening the deep lines of her face. "Oh, you made it," she said. Her voice was weak but warm, and she pulled me into a tight embrace. The first night was simple enough. We sat in the kitchen, ate homemade pie, and listened to the quiet hum of the night outside. The only sound was the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. But, as the clock struck midnight, I heard something that made me pause mid-bite. A faint tapping noise came from the direction of the back door. I glanced at my grandmother, who looked suddenly tense, her eyes darting to the hallway that led to the back of the house. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, but her lips were pressed into a thin line. "It's probably just the wind," she said, though I could hear the tremor in her voice. I stood up and moved cautiously to the back door. The tapping was louder now, but there was no wind, no reason for it. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the latch and pulled the door open. Darkness met me, nothing but the field and the forest beyond. But then I saw a figure, cloaked in shadow, standing just at the edge of the clearing. It was too far away to make out any features, but it stood motionless, as if waiting. "Grandma, someone's out there," I called, turning back to look at her. Before she could answer, the figure moved forward, stepping out of the shadows. It was not human, not entirely. Its limbs were unnaturally long, joints bending in ways they shouldn't, and its eyes reflected the light from the porch in a sharp, unnatural gleam. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my hands trembling. "We need to call the police." My grandmother's eyes were wide, tears welling up as she reached for my arm. "It's too late," she whispered. "It's already here." The tapping resumed, but now it was all around the house. The walls groaned as though something heavy was pressing against them. A sudden crash sounded from the kitchen, and I spun around to see the figure, impossibly thin and contorted, standing on the other side of the glass window. Its mouth opened wide, a black void lined with teeth that seemed to stretch forever. I grabbed my grandmother's hand, dragging her toward the front door. We stumbled over furniture and ducked past shattered picture frames as the pounding grew louder, more insistent. But before we could make it out, the front door flew open, the hinges splintering as the wind howled through the room. There, framed by the moonlight, was the figure, now more solid, more real than I could have imagined. It stared at us, a twisted, unholy grin stretching across its face. And then I realized the truth. It wasn't here to take us, not tonight. It had come for something else. And behind us, I heard my grandmother's voice, distant and hollow, whispering, "It's here for me." A scream tore through the night as the figure lunged forward. But before it could reach us, it stopped, a ragged shudder passing through its body. Then it crumbled to the floor, melting into a puddle of shadow and wet earth. I blinked, disoriented, and looked at my grandmother. Her eyes were closed, a peaceful smile on her face. The tapping had stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was different, oppressive, and final. When I stepped outside, the figure was gone, but I noticed something. In the field behind the house, the ground was cracked, and the soil was dark, almost black, as though it had been scorched. And in the moonlight, I swore I could see shapes forming, figures reaching up from the earth, waiting for the next visitor. I drove back to the city that night, heart heavy and mind reeling. The countryside was quiet again, but I knew better now. Some things are never truly gone. Some things are just waiting. The bus ride was long and uncomfortable, but I couldn't complain. I was finally visiting my grandmother's farm for the summer, a place I hadn't seen since I was a child. My parents said she had been lonely, so I decided to take a break from my busy city life and spend the next 2 weeks out in the open fields. The bus dropped me off in front of the weathered farmhouse, the wood painted appealing red that clashed with the green of the fields. I smiled, inhaling the crisp, dry air, trying to drown out the nagging feeling that I was forgetting something important. Grandma was waiting for me on the porch. Her hair was white, her smile wide and welcoming. We hugged, and she took my bags inside. The first few days were idyllic. Long walks through the meadows, fresh milk from the cows, and evenings spent on the porch as the sun sank into a horizon of tall, whispering corn stalks. But as the days wore on, I noticed the odd things. At night, when the world was dark and silent, I would hear a faint tapping sound, like a pebble hitting the window. I'd wake up, heart racing, and see only shadows in the moonlight. Grandma assured me it was just the wind, or the old house settling, but I didn't believe her. It wasn't just the tapping, there was something else. Something moving in the fields, just beyond the reach of the porch light. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. I sat up, breathless, listening. The noise came closer, slow and heavy, until it stopped. My heart pounded. I slipped into my shoes and crept to the window. The moonlight spilled across the land, casting everything in a cold, silvery glow. I gasped when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the cornfield, unmoving. It was tall, impossibly so, with thin limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural ways. Its head was tilted back, and its eyes were nothing but dark, hollow pits. I blinked and it was gone, vanished into the maze of stalks. My mind raced. It was too dark, too far for me to see clearly. I shivered, questioning my sanity. Maybe it was just an illusion, a trick of the moonlight. I turned to find Grandma asleep in her chair, breathing steady and deep. But when I looked at the clock, I noticed the time, 3:27 a.m., the same time the tapping had started, the same time the footsteps came. The next day, the sun hung heavy in the sky as I worked with Grandma in the barn. She hummed a tune while she sorted feed, and I thought maybe I had been imagining things after all. But, as the day ended and dusk began to settle, a low rumble in the distance caught my attention. It was coming from the direction of the cornfield. Grandma noticed too, pausing mid-task. Her eyes darted to the field, and a shadow flickered across her face. "It's the crows," she said, her voice unsteady. "They don't like it when he comes." I frowned, puzzled. "Who?" Grandma didn't answer, and I felt a chill spread through me. That night, I sat in the dark, the old house creaking as it settled. The tapping started again, and then, faintly, a low humming sound, like a twisted lullaby. I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sensation of something watching me. I turned my head, eyes adjusting to the faint light, and there it was, the figure from before, standing at the window. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. Its hollow eyes met mine, and it moved. Fingers splayed against the glass as if it were trying to press through. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy book, and threw it at the glass. The window shattered, and for a split second, the figure vanished. I ran to find Grandma. I found her at the kitchen table, staring out the window into the dark. She didn't turn to look at me, and when I approached her, I noticed her hand was pressed tightly against the glass, leaving behind a print I couldn't understand. It wasn't the mark of a human hand. "It's here," she whispered, eyes wide with a terror I'd never seen before. "And he's coming back." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed outside. Not from the field, but from within the house. Slow, deliberate, right behind me. I didn't need to look. I knew I wouldn't like what I saw. It was an ordinary Saturday, and I decided to spend the day exploring the local flea market. It was sprawling and chaotic, filled with vendors selling everything from vintage clothing to antique furniture. I loved getting lost in the maze of tents and booths, weaving around people as I sifted through old trinkets and forgotten relics. Midway through the afternoon, I found myself drawn to a small, nondescript booth in the corner of the market. The man running it had an air of mystery, dressed in a tattered coat with eyes that flickered like candle flames whenever they caught the sunlight. The items on display were bizarre. Antique dolls with cracked porcelain faces, black and white photographs of people I didn't recognize, and small, delicate boxes with strange carvings. I was just about to leave when I spotted an old music box. It was ornately carved, with tiny dancers spinning in circles beneath a glass dome. I reached out, and as my fingers brushed it, the man's voice cut through the noise of the market. "Careful with that," he said, his tone sharp. "It's been known to attract attention." I froze, looking up at him. His smile was thin, almost predatory. "What kind of attention?" I asked, half joking. He leaned closer, eyes glinting with something unholy. "The kind you don't want." Before I could respond, a loud crash came from nearby, followed by the sound of panicked voices. I turned and saw a crowd gathering around a stall that had toppled over, scattering its contents across the pavement. My heart thudded with the sudden burst of chaos, and I shook my head, trying to ignore the man's words. I left the booth, music box still in hand, though it felt wrong, heavy in a way that didn't make sense. I wandered through the market, the noise and laughter suddenly grating on my nerves. The sun began to dip, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement, and the air grew colder. Then, the music started. A soft, tinkling melody floated up from the music box I still held. It was a simple song, but it sent a chill crawling up my spine. I looked down at it, heart pounding, but the dancers remained frozen beneath the dome. The music should have stopped. The box wasn't wound up. I tried to put it down, but my fingers clamped tighter around it, as if someone else had control. I felt a cold breeze sweep through the market, stirring up paper cups and plastic bags. The voices of the crowd blurred into a low hum, as though muffled by a thick wall. And then I saw her, a girl in a faded, old-fashioned dress standing at the far end of the market. Her face was pale, with eyes like black holes that seemed to pierce right through me. She took a slow step forward, and the music box continued its haunting song. My pulse quickened, and I stumbled backward, bumping into someone behind me. I whirled around, but the market was empty, save for me and the girl who now stood only a few feet away. The air grew colder, a sharp, biting chill that turned my breath to fog. I took another step back, but the girl's head tilted slightly, a cruel grin spreading across her face. A voice, thin and chilling, echoed inside my mind, "Play with me." The music box clattered to the pavement as I tried to run. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through water, and my breath came in ragged gasps. But no matter how hard I pushed, I couldn't move faster than the girl. Her eyes never left mine, and with every step, the air around us seemed to grow darker. I finally broke through the market and into the empty parking lot, where the late afternoon light was dim and dying. I couldn't see her anymore, but the song still played, winding through the parking lot like a thread pulling me back toward the chaos. I turned to grab the music box, but it was gone. I searched frantically, eyes darting over the cracked pavement. The song stopped suddenly, cutting off in a sharp note. Silence fell like a weight, and I swore I heard the faint sound of soft footsteps behind me. I spun around, but the market was empty. The girl had vanished, and with her, the eerie melody that haunted me like a ghost. That was the last time I went back to that flea market, and the last time I ever heard a music box play. But I know it's still out there, waiting, because I can still hear the faint, haunting notes when the wind picks up at night. It started as a day trip. My friends and I decided to head to the old amusement park on the edge of town. It had been shut down for years, ever since a series of accidents forced the city to close it down. I don't know why we chose that place. Maybe we were curious. Maybe we just wanted to prove we were brave. But from the moment we stepped through the rusted gate, something felt wrong. The park was overrun with weeds and vines that clawed their way up the rusted skeletons of roller coasters and Ferris wheels. The painted signs were faded, peeling, their once cheerful colors muted by time and decay. It felt as if the place had been waiting for us, the silence broken only by the distant sound of crows cawing. We laughed it off, taking pictures and making jokes, but the laughter didn't reach my chest. I felt a chill every time I passed the cracked bumper cars, their paint chipped and dull, the seats torn. Something about them seemed familiar, like they were expecting me to get in. Then we made our way to the funhouse, its funhouse mirrors warped and dark. The entrance creaked as we pushed it open, and a draft of cold air washed over me. The inside was a maze of mirrors that seemed to stretch and bend, showing reflections that weren't quite right. I noticed my friends laughing as they walked ahead, their reflections bending in impossible ways, their eyes distorted and wide as I walked through. I stopped in front of a mirror that showed me with a twisted smile and eyes far too big. My own face, staring back, seemed like it wasn't mine. I backed away, tripping over my own feet, and spun around to call out to my friends. But they were already gone, their voices echoing faintly from somewhere deeper inside. I ran after them, my footsteps swallowed by the hollow hallways. The sounds of their laughter had stopped. I reached an area where the mirrors were shattered, jagged shards protruding from the floor like teeth. I stepped carefully, heart racing, and then I heard a slow, rhythmic tapping, like someone walking with heavy boots behind me. I spun around, my chest heaving, but there was no one there. A sudden crash reverberated through the funhouse, and I jolted. The sound came from the direction I had been heading. I pushed through the torn curtains and stepped out into the open air, gasping for breath. The sky had darkened, and the crows had grown louder, their caws echoing like screams. I scanned the park, looking for my friends. They were nowhere in sight, but then a shadow caught my eye, a figure, cloaked in something that looked like tattered fabric, standing under the Ferris wheel. It was too still, too quiet, and then I realized it wasn't just standing. It was facing me. The figure stepped forward, moving with an unnatural grace, its arms swinging too far as if disjointed. I stumbled back, tripping over an abandoned ride. I reached out, my hands scraping against the cold metal. I tried to push myself up. "Hey," a voice called out, sharp and familiar. It was my friend Jody. I turned, relief flooding through me as I saw her and the others running toward me. But when I looked past them, the figure was still there, unmoving, watching. Its face was obscured by a hood, but I could see a pale hand raised in a slow, deliberate wave. The others reached me, breathless, eyes wide. Jody glanced over her shoulder, and her face drained of color. "Did you see that thing?" she whispered. Before I could answer, the sound of the old roller coaster creaking filled the air, and the figure turned, slowly, as if pulled by some invisible force. We didn't stick around to see what happened next. We ran, the wind tearing at our clothes, the distant laughter of the funhouse echoing like a cruel joke. When we made it back to the car, we looked at each other, gasping, trying to process what we'd seen. The park loomed behind us, silent again, as if it had never been disturbed, but as we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood at the edge of the park, watching, with a small, twisted smile that I could never unsee. It was supposed to be a simple day trip to the old amusement park, long forgotten and left to the elements after the fire that shut it down years ago. My friends and I were always up for a bit of mischief and adventure. So when we heard the place was still standing, we decided to go check it out. The sun was high, the air crisp with a hint of autumn, and we felt invincible as we parked our car on the cracked pavement and stepped through the rusted gate. The park was a maze of half-collapsed rides and faded attractions, their colors peeling and names barely visible beneath layers of grime. We explored for hours, climbing into the derelict roller coaster, peering into the hollow eyes of animatronic animals in the old petting zoo, and laughing like kids again. The air carried a sense of nostalgia, tinged with something else, something heavy, that clung to our skin. As the sun began to set, a chill settled over the park. It was just past 6 p.m., and shadows stretched across the ground, twisting and bending with the wind. We were on the Ferris wheel when it happened. The creaking of the metal, once a reassuring sound of the ride, grew louder, sharper, as if the wheel was straining under some unseen weight. The laughter between us stopped abruptly as we looked out over the park, searching for what could be causing it. That's when I saw just a flicker at first, like a shadow dancing at the edge of my vision. I leaned over the railing to get a better look, but it was gone. I turned to my friends, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Their faces mirrored my own apprehension, and I realized none of us wanted to be there. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first sound was a sharp, metal screech that split the silence. It came from the direction of the old funhouse. We all exchanged glances, the air between us charged with a fear that no amount of bravado could dispel. Without a word, we slid out of the Ferris wheel seats and started walking toward the noise, our feet crunching on the gravel path. The funhouse loomed ahead, its mirrors shattered and its entrance yawning like a mouth ready to swallow us whole. We stood in front of the broken doors, breath shallow, before stepping inside. The musty smell of mildew and decay surrounded us, and our flashlights cast jittery beams across warped reflections that seemed to twist and stretch as we passed. We turned a corner and saw a figure, half hidden in the shattered shards of a mirror. It was a person, or it had been. The glass had splintered through its face, leaving an expression frozen mid-scream. I gasped, stumbling backward. My friends backed away too, eyes wide, bodies tense as we stared at the broken remains. But then, behind us, came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the darkened hallway. "Go," someone whispered, and we sprinted out of the funhouse, hearts pounding. The path to the exit was obscured by the deepening night, but we kept running, pushing past the amusement rides and dodging the rusted remains of bumper cars. We glanced behind us, but saw nothing, just the stretch of empty, moonlit pathways. But when we reached the old ticket booth, the front door creaked open, and out stepped a figure. It wasn't human. Its limbs were twisted, bent at impossible angles, as if the bones had been replaced with wire and shadows. Its face was a warped mask, half hidden beneath a hood that seemed to flicker like flame. Before we could scream, it was gone, vanished into the night with a movement too quick to follow. We stopped only when we were outside the gate, gasping and clinging to each other, as if the park itself were trying to pull us back in. The next day, I scoured the news for any mention of the park. There was nothing, not a word about strange occurrences or people going missing. But every time I close my eyes, I see that figure at the ticket booth, eyes like hollow black pits, waiting for the next unwelcome visitors. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or any of that supernatural nonsense. I've always been a skeptic, especially when it comes to stories about creepy houses or strange occurrences. But that changed one weekend. My friends and I rented a house out in the woods for a getaway. The place was old, but charming, nestled in a clearing with towering trees surrounding it. We arrived late in the afternoon, the air crisp and cool, a perfect setting for a few days of escape. The house had this old-world charm-worn wooden floors, an overgrown garden, and creaking stairs that added to its character. That night, after dinner and drinks, we were all lounging around the living room. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the room. It wasn't long before we started telling ghost stories, the usual stuff, spooky tales that only serve to make you laugh at how ridiculous they are. At least, that's what I thought. But then, Sarah, one of my friends, told us about the house's previous owner, an old woman who had lived there alone for years before passing away. People in the area said she had been eccentric, and some claimed to have seen strange lights in the windows at night. I didn't think much of it, just more campfire fodder. But something about the way Sarah described it gave me an odd feeling, like she wasn't telling the whole story. We all went to bed, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept in as I lay in my room, the wind howling outside. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but as I drifted off to sleep, I heard it, a soft tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind, branches tapping against the window, but then it came again, gentle, deliberate, like someone knocking on the door. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. The tapping continued, slowly, methodically. I was frozen, too terrified to move. Was it one of my friends playing a prank? I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The sound was too close now, as if whoever or whatever was at the door was standing right outside. Then, a whisper, not a voice from inside the house, but from just beyond the door. It wasn't words, just a low, guttural sound, like someone breathing heavily. I must have stayed there, motionless, for what felt like hours, but eventually, the sound stopped. I was too scared to go back to sleep. So, us lay there in the dark, staring at the door. Eventually, the morning light filtered through the windows, and the house felt quieter, more ordinary. The next morning, I didn't mention what had happened. I assumed it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had been stronger than I thought. But, as we were having breakfast, Sarah mentioned something odd. She said she had heard someone walking around outside her window in the middle of the night. I didn't say anything at first, but the others began sharing similar stories. Mark had heard a knock on his door. Emily had heard what sounded like footsteps on the stairs. We all chalked it up to nerves or old house creaks. But deep down, we all felt something wasn't quite right. That afternoon, we decided to go hiking through the woods, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. We stayed out for hours, but when we returned to the house, the mood had shifted. The air felt thicker, and the house felt colder, though the fire was still burning in the hearth. It wasn't until later, that evening, that we finally saw something that didn't make sense. The front door, which we had all double-checked before leaving, was wide open. None of us had opened it. We stood there, staring at the door, unsure what to do. Mark walked over to close it, and that's when we all saw it. At the foot of the door, barely visible in the dim light, was a single, muddy footprint. It was large, as if someone had been standing there, right outside. But no one had been outside the house when we were gone. The tension in the room was unbearable. We all stayed close together after that, too afraid to be alone. We heard no more tapping or whispers, but the air remained thick, oppressive. It was as if something or someone was watching us, waiting for the right moment. That night, after we had all retreated to our rooms, I heard it again. A knock, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. But this time, I wasn't alone. I heard it from the other rooms too. We all got up, too scared to sleep, and met in the hallway. We walked down the stairs together, our flashlights shaking in our hands. The knocking stopped when we reached the door. We all stood there, eyes wide, too scared to move. Then, slowly, the door creaked open on its own. I'll never forget the feeling of cold air rushing past us as we stared into the dark night beyond. And then, as if in response to our shock, we heard it, a laugh, high-pitched and unsettling, echoing from the trees outside. It was the old woman's laugh. But no one was there, nothing was there. We left the house the next morning, never looking back. I never liked working late. There's something eerie about being the only person left in a building when the lights flicker and the halls echo with your footsteps. But this was a deadline I couldn't ignore. The office was quiet, almost too quiet. As I typed away at my desk, my phone had died hours ago, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. I glanced at the clock, 3 a.m. The office was supposed to close at midnight, but everyone else had left, and I was alone, finishing up some last-minute work. I tried not to think about the strange occurrences that had been happening over the past few nights. At first, I chalked it up to being tired or paranoid, but now, something didn't feel right. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than they should have been, and every now and then, I could swear I heard something, a soft tap-tap, like fingernails on a desk. I shook it off. It was probably just the building settling, the air conditioning groaning. But as the sound persisted, I started to feel uneasy. The tap-tap became more frequent, like someone was walking around the office, except I was the only one here. My heart began to race. I glanced at the door. It was shut tight, as it had been all night. But then I heard something I couldn't ignore, a loud, distinct click, like a door unlocking. I froze, staring at the door. The office was locked. I was sure of it. I checked the entrance when everyone left, but now it was open a crack, just wide enough for someone or something to slip through. I stood up slowly, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. There was no way I was imagining this. I reached for my phone, but of course, it was dead. I didn't even have a flashlight. I couldn't afford to stay here any longer. I grabbed my coat and made my way to the door. As I stepped closer, I saw the silhouette of someone standing in the hallway. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, and seemed to be staring straight at me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though its face was obscured by shadows. Panic surged through me, but before I could react, the figure slowly turned and walked down the hallway, its footsteps echoing off the walls. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my legs refused to cooperate. Then the sound came again, tap tap tap, louder now, like it was walking toward me. I turned to look, my stomach dropping as I saw the figure reappear at the end of the hallway. This time, it was closer. It was no longer walking, it was floating toward me, gliding across the floor with an eerie smoothness. And as it neared, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure didn't have a face. There was just a smooth, featureless surface where a face should be. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing continued to glide closer, and I realized I couldn't escape. The exit was too far, and the figure was moving faster than I could. But just as I thought I was about to be caught, the figure stopped. It hovered in place, and for a long moment, it did nothing. My breath came in sharp gasps, my body frozen in fear, and then I heard a voice. Not from the figure, but from somewhere deeper in the office. "Why are you still here?" The voice was faint, like it came from behind a wall, but the question struck me to my core. It was not an accusation, but a statement. Why was I still here? I didn't have an answer. I couldn't think of one. I just wanted to get out, but before I could move, the lights above me flickered violently, then went out completely, plunging the office into total darkness. I heard the figure move again, closer now. Its footsteps were right behind me, growing louder, faster, as if it was closing in. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty, silent office. I ran to the door and yanked it open, stumbling into the hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was behind me. I made it to the stairwell and down to the lobby. As I burst through the front door into the night air, I could finally breathe again. The next day, I went to the office early, hoping I had just imagined the whole thing. But when I arrived, everything seemed off. The lights were flickering, and the air felt thick, as if it had been waiting for me. I went to my desk, and there, sitting right in the middle, was my phone fully charged and open to a message that hadn't been there before. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "Don't come back." I didn't return to the office after that. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that whatever that thing was, it's still watching. And I have no idea what it wants, but I know one thing for sure: I won't be working late again. We wanted a break from the city, a chance to disconnect and enjoy the quiet. The cabin was old but charming, situated at the edge of a dense forest. We were excited to leave behind our phones, forget about work, and just relax. The first night was perfect. We cooked dinner together, cracked open a few beers, and sat around the fire. The only sound was the crackling of the flames and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. The kind of peace you can't get anywhere else. Around midnight, we all went to bed. My room was upstairs, and as soon as I laid down, I noticed how still everything felt. No wind, no sounds from the woods, just silence. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, but it kept nagging at me. It was too quiet. Then I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate. Tap, 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 slow and rhythmic. My heart raced, but I told myself it was nothing. I turned on my side, pulled the blankets over my head, and tried to sleep, but the tapping didn't stop. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, heart pounding, and walked over to the window. I peeked through the curtains, expecting to see a tree branch swaying in the wind, but there was nothing, just darkness. I stood there for a few moments, confused, but then I heard it again, this time from the back of the house. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. It was impossible. I was the only one upstairs. My friends were all downstairs, or so I thought. I grabbed my phone, texted the others, and asked if they were messing with me. No reply. I quietly went downstairs, trying not to make a sound. As I reached the bottom, I saw the front door slightly ajar. That was strange, none of us had gone outside. I pushed the door open, thinking someone had gone for a walk, but there was no one there. The house was eerily quiet now. No voices, no sounds. I called out, but my voice echoed back to me, swallowed by the silence. Then I heard it, a soft whispering, coming from the kitchen. I stepped into the room, but when I switched on the light, it was empty. The whispering stopped. I started to turn away, but then I noticed something on the floor, a set of muddy footprints, leading from the back door to the kitchen. They were fresh. My heart stopped. I followed the trail through the house, my mind racing. The footprints led into the hallway, and then, as if on cue, the floorboards creaked above me. Someone was upstairs. I rushed up the stairs, but when I reached the top, the hallway was empty. No one was there. That's when the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The door was shut tight now, locked. I was sure I hadn't closed it. I stood there, staring at the door, when I heard something else. The faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the attic. I hadn't even noticed the door to the attic until now. It was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it unnerving. I didn't want to go up there. I wanted to leave, to drive away as fast as I could. But the footsteps were getting closer, and I felt like I had no choice. I pulled open the attic door, the old wood creaking, and climbed the narrow stairs, my breath tight in my chest. The room was dark, but as I switched on the light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a mirror in the attic. It wasn't there when we arrived. It hadn't been in any of the photos from the listing, but there it was, standing in the center of the room, framed in thick black wood, and standing in front of it, staring back at me, was me, a perfect reflection, but something was off. The reflection was grinning, wide and unnerving, its eyes hollow and dark. I blinked, and the figure in the mirror did the same, but with an expression I didn't recognize. It smiled wider, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I backed away slowly, my legs shaking, but then it wasn't just in the mirror anymore. The thing was standing behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The attic was empty, except for the mirror. I couldn't breathe. I didn't understand. It was like the reflection. It wasn't just a reflection. I ran out of the attic, down the stairs, and grabbed my phone. I called my friends, but none of them answered. I had to leave, but when I opened the door, I saw them standing in the yard. Their faces were blank, staring ahead. It wasn't until I reached the car that I realized they weren't really there. The cabin was abandoned when we left. There were no footprints, no signs anyone had ever been there. And as we drove away, I looked back. In the window of the cabin, I saw something. A figure, grinning, watching me leave. I don't know what happened that night, but I do know one thing. When I looked in that mirror, I didn't see me.